Olá a todos, adoro começar com olá a todos. Muito obrigada pela presença de vocês. Já agradecendo as pessoas que vão entrando. Eu sou Juliana Bastos Marques, professora de História Antiga na Unirio, e a gente está aqui começando a nossa aula magna 2021.1, que é uma aula magna para todos os... Assim, 2021 já está bem na frente, mas assim, né? A princípio, a aula magna para todos os ingressantes 2021, seja no calendário acadêmico ou, enfim, no calendário do ano, né? E aí, não se preocupem, porque a gente está lá na frente, em 2021, estamos fazendo a aula magna agora, porque, vamos dizer assim, que é uma certa tradição, não se importar tanto com isso. O importante é ter a aula magna e começar o curso com uma introdução legal, com uma pessoa que vai trazer algumas ideias muito interessantes para todos nós. Então, eu quero, antes de apresentar a professora Rebeca, eu queria passar rapidinho a palavra para os nossos, já que é uma aula inaugural, né? A palavra para os nossos colegas. Primeiro, o professor Vanderlei Vasilevski Ribeiro, que é o diretor da Escola de História. Vanderlei, dá um oi para nós aqui.
Boa tarde a todas e todas. Cumprimento a professora Juliana pela feliz iniciativa de retomarmos as aulas inaugurais, as aulas magnas, e com uma professora extremamente capaz e que vai trazer certamente um tema atualíssimo para todos nós.
Obrigado, Vanderlei, obrigado por... Bom, você foi sucinto o suficiente, legal, foi bom, assim, para a gente não demorar muito, para a palestra começar logo. Então, eu vou trazer um pouquinho, rapidamente, também a palavra do professor Anderson Oliveira, que é o coordenador do PPGH, o nosso programa de pós-graduação. Anderson.
Boa tarde. Gostaria também de agradecer a iniciativa da professora Juliana pelo convite, a professora Roberta Kennedy. Como o Vanderlei falou, o tema é de grande atualidade e importância, principalmente no momento político em que vivemos, não só no Brasil, mas no mundo de uma forma geral. E é importante que a gente possa iniciar, na verdade, como a Juliana falou, que não seja no início, mas que a gente possa, na sequência dos nossos trabalhos acadêmicos, trazer uma discussão desse porte aqui com uma especialista no tema. Então, mais uma vez, agradeço a professora Juliana e a professora Rebeca por ter aceito o convite e uma boa aula magna para todos nós. Obrigado.
Antes, então, de apresentar a professora Rebeca, eu só queria falar para vocês rapidamente como é que a gente vai fazer, como é que vai ser a dinâmica da nossa live hoje. Então, eu vou daqui a pouco, quando a palestra estiver começada, eu vou passar o link no chat para o certificado, tá? É um formulário do Google, você clica lá, nome, endereço de e-mail, instituição, coloca lá e depois a gente vai mandar o certificado para vocês. E deixa eu ver quem mais. É o seguinte, a palestra é o seguinte: vocês não são obrigados a saber inglês. Eu ia brincar assim, ainda, mas enfim, vocês não são obrigados a saber inglês. Portanto, a palestra está legendada em português. Mas como é que ela está legendada? Eu pedi para ela gravar um pouquinho a palestra alguns dias antes, ela gravou, mandou o vídeo para mim, o vídeo está legendado em português, a gente vai passar agora, mas vocês vão ver que ela está aqui ao vivo com a gente, vai dar um oi, e quando o vídeo da palestra acabar, a gente volta para o debate. Então, eu vou passar aqui a tela do vídeo da palestra para vocês, que tem aproximadamente um pouquinho menos de 1 hora, e tudo com legenda em português, para todo mundo entender. Então, agora vou apresentar, vamos colocar aqui. And now let's introduce. We're going to switch between Portuguese and English, right? Então, assim, nas perguntas, o pessoal vou ver aqui no chat, eu faço para inglês, traduzo português, aquela coisa toda. So, welcome, Professor Rebecca Futo Kennedy. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I already knew that. No, not that you were going to say yes. I mean, I knew that if you said yes, it was going to be great. And I, of course, already saw your presentation, your lecture. I know it's going to be great. So I knew I was doing the right thing. I'm excited about this. Well, we're kind of informal, right? You know me already. We're kind of informal.
Yeah.
Gente, eu tô empolgada falando com ela, que eu tô muito feliz, que eu sabia que se ela fosse aceitar, ela ia arrebentar, e arrebentou mesmo. A palestra é ótima, vocês vão adorar. Então, I'll introduce you in Portuguese.
Yeah, whatever you need.
A professora Rebeca é professora da Denison University, em Ohio, nos Estados Unidos, e ela é especialista na Grécia Clássica, na Atenas Clássica, teatro grego. Recentemente, agora em 2017, ela editou o Companion da Abril sobre Ésquilo, sua recepção de Ésquilo, e ela também tem outros livros, vários artigos e outros livros. Por exemplo, ela trabalha com imigração de mulheres, mulheres dentro da ideia de imigração na Grécia Antiga, ou seja, questões identitárias, questões de gênero, e também trabalha com questões de raça e etnicidade no mundo antigo. Inclusive, eu tenho aqui o livro que ela editou, que eu recomendo para vocês, que é uma antologia de textos sobre o tema. Muito legal, enfim, muito legal. E que mais? Bom, e ela trabalha também, um dos grandes temas que ela trabalha e que eu particularmente tenho começado a estudar também por razões de necessidade de sobrevivência no mundo moderno, são as reverberações da tradição clássica no mundo contemporâneo, e como essas reverberações não necessariamente são reverberações que estão ligadas ao passado necessariamente, eles estão ligadas a nós e as nossas preocupações e a preocupações políticas do nosso mundo. Então, deixa eu ver. Rebecca, can you say a few words? I'm going to just say something, two things.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Ela é super conhecida, vocês têm que conhecer o blog dela, eu vou colocar o link aí do blog dela, tá? E a conta dela no Twitter é maravilhosa, tem que seguir, tá? Eu vou colocar a @ dela no Twitter. Quem é do Twitter, que vai lá, segue aí ela no Twitter, porque o conteúdo das coisas do que ela produz é muito legal, vale a pena. Ok, so all the compliments, say hi to everyone.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you so much for allowing me to share my research with you. And I just want to say thank you so very much to Juliana for the work on translating my talk for you to enjoy this afternoon, and then also for facilitating all this. It's a pleasure to be here.
Bom, gente, então, aí ela agradeceu que eu traduzi, ela agradeceu o convite, vocês já sabem como é, né? Eu vou passar agora, então, para a palestra, e que vai quase parecer que é ao vivo, porque é no mesmo fundo, é no mesmo lugar que ela gravou, tá? Então, assim que ela terminar, a gente volta aqui para o debate. Pode começar a fazer colocações, debate, pergunta no chat, tá? O chat serve para isso. E a gente está aqui para pegar as perguntas de vocês, inclusive as mais cabeludas, que ela está acostumada a responder as perguntas cabeludas sobre o assunto. E vamos lá, então. Deixa eu passar aqui para vocês. Agora, remove us from the screen, ok?
Hi, I'm Rebecca Futo Kennedy, and I'm here today to talk about the uses of the Greco-Roman past in modern racist and supremacist discourses. In November of 2018, I, along with your colleague, Juliana Bastos, joined over 20 scholars from the United States, Britain, France, Ghana, Turkey, Germany, Brazil, Greece, and others at a workshop called Claiming the Classical on current political uses of imagery, texts, and ideas from ancient Greece and Rome in far-right identitarian movements, in decolonization movements, in diplomacy and cultural exchange, immigration debates, and more. Different national traditions of associating with the Greco-Roman past shaped the way that claims were made upon or through the classical. This idea of the ancient Greek and Roman past, which we sort of cluster together as the classical. Some discussed European lands that claimed descent from ancient Greece or Rome directly, Others discussed non-European lands once part of ancient Greco-Roman empires, and still others discussed lands colonized by Europeans where ancient Greece and Rome were used to build new identities in these new lands. In North America especially, claims for modern identities built upon notions of descent, direct descent from ancient Greeks and Romans, take a particularly insidious form. These claims have been made in the service of constructing racial hierarchies and to exclude those classified as non-white, white or Caucasian being the term often used, and to enslave and even eradicate those non-white people. So today I want to address and discuss some of the ways in which this use of the ancient Greco-Roman past constructs these racial hierarchies, and how this is manifested over the last 200 years and why it still matters today. Specifically, I want to focus on this thing called white supremacism, which is the idea that people who are classified within racial hierarchies as white or Caucasian sit at the top of a hierarchy by biological or natural design. And the ways in which the classical ideas, particularly the way classical ideas about how identity was shaped, and then are used to build scientific ideas of race, and then how these ideas are then popularized and mobilized through the use of classical art and architecture specifically. One theory that might be a great place to start to give us an idea of the continuing modern resonances of what I'm going to be talking about today is something called Great Replacement theory. It is a theory that's currently popular with far-right groups in both Europe and the United States, Canada, and Australia, and New Zealand. It is a theory that has its roots directly from a book written in 1916 by a man named Madison Grant called The Passing of the Great Race, which also inspired the work of a man named Lothrop Stoddard, written in 1920, called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, both of which were influential books on Adolf Hitler in the creation of his policies in Nazi Germany. The theory became the inspiration also for a 1978 French dystopian fiction novel by the same name, The Great Replacement Theory, about mass immigration of North Africans into France that supposedly overnight replaced the entire population. This novel has become one of the major inspirations of the French far right. The theory itself is currently being promoted on Fox News in the United States, the far-right media giant owned by Australian Rupert Murdoch, to drive political opinion on immigration policy, and it has inspired numerous mass killings. This poster, which you see pictured here, appeared on my university campus in 2019. It depicts Breton Harrison Tarrant, the terrorist who killed over 50 people in a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. He left behind a manifesto, which expressed his belief in Great Replacement theory. The poster itself was made by a group known as Stormfront, one of the oldest continuous neo-Nazi organizations in the United States. The idea is that the mass immigration from the global south, in our case Latin America and Central America, will lead to the replacement of white or Caucasian people of Northern European descent, who are also sometimes referred to as Anglo-Saxons, and the disappearance of the once dominant white race. These ideas were the argument and justification, as far back as the 19th century, but still today, for immigration policies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for the rise of the American eugenics movement that and the practices that it led to, such as forced sterilization of people of color, particularly Black women and Indigenous women, and women deemed hysterical. These ideas were popularized through things like World's Fairs, not only in the United States, but also in France and in Great Britain and even in Italy. And they were also sent out and helped create things like the breakfast cereal industry. The guy Kellogg, who created cornflakes, was in fact a big eugenicist. The ideas that lay behind these ideas were also then popularized, particularly through the use of imagery, architecture, sculpture, and references to a short list of ancient Greek and Roman texts. Now, this classical idea, this packaging of the ancient Greco-Roman past in architectural and art form in public venues, was the public face of the form of racism that we call white supremacism in many ways, and I will provide you with numerous examples below. But it was also the undergirding itself of this construct we call race. Great replacement theory was built off of earlier theories of conquest and replacement concerning antiquity. Example, the so-called Dorian Invasion, which I will discuss in a moment. And the ideas that the Greeks and Romans themselves had about human physical and cultural difference were the infrastructure for the development of both race science, which is the actual categories and typologies that are still used in physical anthropology and population genetics today, or in census forms where you have to check a box if you are black or white or not, and in scientific racism, racist ideas that dress themselves up as if they are objective science in order to justify their claims. And here we might think of studies that show links between skin color and IQ or intelligence, specifically found in things like the book The Bell Curve by Charles Murray, and promoted on websites like the Canadian Australian magazine Quillette. Claims made upon the classical as a foundation of modern Western or white peoples and cultures are rooted in these earlier replacement narratives and continue to have a hold in popular, political, and even academic discourses, even if it is if people are unaware of the sources of these ideas. In many ways, it is difficult to listen to or read debates today around immigration, race, or the place of classics in the world without seeing these connections, at least for me. So today, I would like to make my problem your problem by pointing out some of these connections in hopes that it will open people's eyes and make us all more critical consumers and participants in what seems to be a very vibrant discussion and indeed culture war over the place of ancient Greco-Roman antiquity in our modern discourses. Now, I'll start with this idea of ancient conceptions of race and ethnicity. They were much studied in the classical education that was standard in the 19th and 20th centuries in US and European colonized universities. Beginning with great replacement theory today, obviously, I want to explore the ways that such ideas were resurrected and manipulated as a science of man that could be used and continue to be used to justify slavery, then segregation, eugenic thinking, and anti-immigration policies. Now, I want to start with a quotation from someone who you might not be familiar with. His name is Tucker Carlson. He is a prominent radio pundit, television pundit for this media conglomerate called Fox News, owned by Rupert Murdoch. He was recently taken to task by people because he positively discussed great replacement theory on his news show. And I want to start with this one quotation because it gets into something that I think is actually quite important. He says, as he follows, and this is his defense for discussing great replacement theory. He says, "I know that the left and all of its little gatekeepers on Twitter become literally hysterical if you use the term replacement. If you suggest for the Democratic Party that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world." So how do we interpret this phrase that he said? Here is one suggestion. Nearly every phrase of Carlson's statement is the euphemistic expression of a white supremacist replacement doctrine. The Democratic Party means liberals, which for him translates to Jews. They are importing new people from the third world, which means people with black and brown skin. Those kinds of people in his racist trope are obedient, meaning they are docile, backward, and stupid. Their votes do not constitute real democracy because they are replacing the current electorate, which is presumably whiter and less docile. These paler, truer Americans are thus deprived of their birthright of political dominance, and fighting back, making sure that third world people have less power, becomes a defense of the American way. This is how one person described what Tucker Carlson was saying. And I want to hone in on a few things. The first one is the word obedient, because what we actually see through this quotation and why I wanted to bring it up is the connection between great replacement theory and ancient scientific ideas. So what we're actually going to see with this word obedient and elsewhere is the modern supremacist discourse, scientific race discourse surrounding whiteness and the superiority of white or Caucasian people to others are the three following ancient ideas. One, that they are environmental or climatic determinism theory, which is one way to sort of understand differences between ancient peoples. 2, evolution, or the progress of societies or civilizations. You move from being a savage civilization to being a civilized civilization. And then finally, Jim Crow legislation, or sorry, eugenics, which led to, in the United States, Jim Crow legislation, which is the deep segregation and anti-miscegenation legislation. And in Europe was actually one of the core. In Britain, it was a major class issue where they were actually sterilizing the lower classes. And then, of course, in Germany, it led to the Holocaust. So where to start? I'm going to try and bring these 3 things together and show how they sort of impact and continue to impact modern discourses around immigration and race. So I want to start with environmental determinism. And this is a theory from antiquity that our earliest direct reference to and actual structural discussion of comes from the Hippocratic corpus. So environmental determinism is essentially the idea that the physical space that one inhabits, its topography, its geography, and the climate actually shape customs, physical appearance of people, and their moral character, and not on the individual level, but on the level of groups. Right, and so this is sort of the core to what we think of as continental identities: Africans, Europeans, indigenous. These categories, Asians, right? These categories all come from this idea of continental structures and environmental impact. Now, the earliest example of this comes from a guy named Hippocrates, and it comes from a text called the Airs, Waters, Places. Some elements of this actually appear earlier in Hesiod and Homer, but Hippocrates, our sort of father of ancient medicine, Greek medicine, is the guy who sort of explicates it. And it'll also continue onward and make its appearances also in Aristotle and also in the architectural manual of Vitruvius, which is of great interest. So here is a slide that shows 3 key principles. The first is that the environment is going to be the determining factor in the creation of cultural and moral characteristics of groups of people. The second thing is that these become heritable. These characteristics are acquired from the environment, and then you can pass it on to the next generation through giving birth to the next generation. And then finally, this idea that you can use technology to overcome and either alter the environment or to correct for any hereditary deficiencies that the environment might cause on you. These are the general points that are shared basically from this theory all the way from the 5th century BCE up until its more modern manifestations in the 19th century. Vitruvius in particular is important for us because he's our ancient author that emphasizes technology as the controlling discourse. Now, specifically, our Hippocratic author, like Aristotle and Vitruvius, associated warm climates with laziness, darker skin tones, and cowardice. If you give yourself a minute or two to simply think about some of the contemporary stereotypes that adhere to people with darker skin colors in the Americas, and the thread that connects these to environmental theory and modern prejudice seems kind of easy to discern. We often think of people who are from warmer climates or who are darker skinned as being lazier. They are, in fact, more obedient, this word that Tucker Carlson used in his discussion of quote-unquote third world peoples, which he really means by that is the global south. Now, the ancient theory also associated colder climates, northern climates, as it were, with pale or white skin, with courage and independence. In between rested Greece and Italy, which viewed themselves as the perfect balance of hot and cold, wet and dry. These far northern people who had really pale skin, yes, they were courageous and independent, but they were also sort of belligerent and stupid in their courage and in their independence. For Aristotle, Greece and the Greeks were the best because they had the best climate, and for Vitruvius and Pliny the Elder, Italy was the best because it had the best climate. There's more to the theory, which will sort of come around, but that's probably enough of it to get us through to how it transferred to the modern world. Now, in the American context specifically, it gets defined, the definition, the connection between identity and environment as it comes to us through Hippocrates and Vitruvius and others actually has a very deep resonance. In the 19th century, it was combined with the idea of evolution, resulting in something that is referred to often as technogeography theory. This theory finds itself heavily influenced not just by the environmental theory of Hippocrates and Vitruvius, but more directly also by the evolutionary model for society proposed by the Roman poet Lucretius in Book 5. In Book 5 of his poem On the Nature of Things, the De Rerum Natura, Lucretius discusses the evolution of cultures and societies from the savagery to the stages of being quote-unquote civilized. For him, the earth is mortal and it changes over time. It evolves out of chaos and from the collision of atoms, right? Humans develop within this and they were birthed by the earth. So here we have sort of a version of an evolutionary version of what we call autochthony or indigeneity. The first humans had deformities and were unsuited to their environments and they died out. But later generations, right, the humanity evolves first into becoming easily able to conquer and to live within their environments. And then finally, once they are suited to their environments, they begin to develop different types of what we would consider civilizing practices. They move from nomadic to settled, they move from hunter-gatherer to agricultural, and then they slowly develop the things of civilization: clothing, law, marriage customs, family structures, property rights, and various technologies, etc. Now, Lucretius seems to have been one of the most influential texts on the development of both the theories of evolution and on theories of social progress. We also see direct links to things like the British philosopher John Locke and his concept of the noble savage. In these manifestations of race science and scientific racism, there is a presumption that there's a superior group that all other groups are inferior to, and that it is a matter of survival of the fittest, right? A phrase that enters the discourse around race science after the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859, and then The Descent of Man in 1871, thanks to a guy named Herbert Spencer, who was a British philosopher and social scientist who took Darwinian theories of human evolution and applied them to human societies. So basically what you have is these ancient theories from the past of environmental determinism linked up with ideas of evolution of societies that get manifested together into this model of survival of the fittest by a guy named Herbert Spencer, who happened to be a relative of Darwin's, but was heavily influenced by Darwin. Spencer's theories are in many ways the origin of what we would consider the modern forms of scientific racism in public policy. But they sit side by side with these older environmental theories, which combine into the technogeography model. And here I'm going to explain what this technogeography model is, specifically through the funnel of a guy named Otis Mason, who was the first director of anthropology at the Smithsonian Institute in the United States. So for him, what he does is this idea is that technogeography is the idea that humanity progresses from savagery to civilized. It demonstrates progress on an evolutionary chain through the ability to, one, manipulate your environment and resources, and two, to develop technologies to help one live in an environment. Those people who fail to progress, in his own idea, is that if they don't die out on their own, they should in fact be eradicated. I have here, and I know it's hard to see, so you may need to make your screen larger, is selections from a chart that he made that show how he places people on the hierarchical structure based on technology. So whole groups of peoples, right? And the categories are lower savage, middle savage, upper savage, lower barbarous, middle barbarous, upper barbarous, and civilized. And various peoples will fit in various ways. And based on where you fall, if you fall into the savage and even the lower barbarous, where he has sort of links, right? Different types of indigenous peoples all falling under these grades of savage and then lower barbarous. And then when you get to middle barbarous, you have people like the Aztecs. Upper barbarous are the Semitic races. And then finally, when you get to the civilized, you get those that are classified as Aryan, or which we would today call white, predominantly people of Northern European descent and Western European descent. This is a quotation from him to show you what I mean by his policy of how technology and environment decide whether or not a group of people should or should not be allowed to continue living. The right progress looks forward to a time when the whole earth will have been exploited. Every pernicious plant and animal or man or tribe has been removed, and all that is good domesticated. When the powers of nature will be harnessed or enslaved, when distance and time will offer no impediment to commerce, and when it will be easy to put production and consumption in friendly union at the springing up of desire, as it was for primitive man and woman. So this idea basically being that humanity is in a movement of progress from savage to the most civilized, that this progress is denoted by the way in which groups of people are able to deploy technology in order to manipulate and control their environments. And those groups, those pernicious tribes, animals, and plants that get in the way can either be removed if they cannot be domesticated. So that's sort of one theory that derives from our ancient ideas that was then put into practice in policies surrounding indigenous peoples. That is premised on the idea that that white people who are of Northern European descent or Euro-American descent, are superior to others, and this is demonstrated by their ability to wield technology and their ability to manipulate environment instead of being manipulated by it. Now, Otis Mason was heavily influenced by the work of Herbert Spencer, our man who introduced the phrase "the survival of the fittest" into the lexicons of science. There were many other American scientists, anthropologists, and humanists in higher education and all over the world who were in fact influenced by his ideas. Herbert Spencer himself was also heavily influenced, as were all of these others, by another ancient author, particularly Plato, and his work, The Republic, which has become the most read and used ancient text in modern universities all over the world. In what is perhaps one of the most well-known passages from this most widely read text in higher education, Socrates speaks to a man named Glaucon, and they discuss how the population of their ideal city, their republic, will be managed and ordered. It's the part of the text that is often referred to as the noble lie. This is the story that they will tell the people who live in their society in order to encourage them to stay within the hierarchical rating system and classification system that they've placed them in. Key elements of this section include, one, an emphasis on a story of each group having been born into specific classes or races, either by nature, right? So they are gold, they are silver, they are bronze, or they are iron, and these metals represent the sort of value and importance of the people. And the idea is that these groups should be segregated so that only gold and silver people mate with gold and silver people, and only iron and bronze people mate with iron and bronze people, in order to preserve the desired social, political, and we might think racial stratification within the society. In discussing marriage practices in the same passage, Socrates and Glaucon also establish that it's the best practice to only allow the best stock, they say, best stock to breed. And here's a quotation, right? Given that it's best to breed the best with the best as often as possible, and the worst to breed with the worst as infrequently as possible, it's also necessary that the children of the best be raised and those of the worst not be. Additionally, if our flock is to be at its peak, everything we have done to make it so needs to remain hidden from everyone except the rulers themselves. Now, imagine a classroom at a university where you are reading Plato's Republic, and you are in fact reading it alongside of the work of Herbert Spencer and his social Darwinism. This actually was very common, not just in United States universities, but also in Britain and elsewhere, all throughout the last 100 years. Now, Spencer himself, Herbert Spencer, was not necessarily the biggest fan of Darwin's theory of evolution when he first read it. He is actually what we call a Lamarckian. Lamarck was an earlier evolutionary theorist who he has sort of an alternative model to evolution from Darwin's. If Darwin's theory can be summed up as natural selection, i.e. over time, over long periods of time, the idea is that nature will weed out bad elements in people and animals and things, and will adapt to to environment. Lamarckian evolutionary theory actually rests on the idea of the ability to inherit acquired characteristics. His theory actually aligns much better with ancient environmental determinism theories than Darwin's does, and also Lamarck's theory aligns much better with the short history of the Earth according to traditional Christian understanding of the age of the world, which was they believed that the world was only about 7,500 years old. Now, the idea of heritability of acquired characteristics is also inherently a part of the Hippocratic theory from antiquity, as well as our technogeography theory from the modern world. Thus, Spencer's idea that societies could pass on acquired moral character as well as physical character, and that these were influenced both by environment and social context, conforms also to what we know of from his adaptations of Lucretius. Further, Spencer's theory was that societies move towards more complexity, right? This idea of progress towards technological advancement that we saw in the other theory. It's easy to see the influence of Spencer, in fact, on our earlier on our other individuals, such as Otis Mason, and on the development of technogeography theory. Importantly, though, if you then read this alongside of Plato, what we see is a move in many ways away from environmental determinism towards eugenics. Eugenics is probably the most recognizable form of race science to most people. This idea that you can socially engineer people by intentional breeding and intermarriage with people within class structures. The man credited with founding eugenics is a man named Sir Francis Galton. He never actually directly quotes Plato or even acknowledges Plato, but we know that he studied Plato's Republic as well as Aristotle's History of Animals and Politics in school. And these are going to be the scaffolding upon which he builds his idea of eugenics. So the Galton Laboratories for National Eugenics was founded in 1904 at the University College London. It was originally titled the Eugenics Record Office. Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin, who believed firmly not only that his cousin's theory of evolution and natural selection was correct, but that you could apply this theory to humans and accelerate it through intentional and careful breeding programs. Sir Francis Galton coined the term eugenics, combining the Greek eu, meaning good, with genos, meaning descent, though the word itself is not ancient. The goal of the laboratory was to influence policy and encourage governments to create programs of forced sterilization and birth control for lower classes and non-whites. After World War II and the recognition of the role that eugenics played in the Holocaust, the laboratory was renamed and its direction was shifted. It became the Department of Genetics, Evolution, and Environment, the three things that we see deriving from our ancient theories from Hippocrates, Vitruvius, Lucretius, and Plato. Now, eugenics was not the earliest form of race science, and it sits beside the theories of environmental determinism in this way. Modern race science's origins, the thing that takes these theories of evolution and hierarchy, racial hierarchy, environmental determinism, and eugenics and puts them all together, actually goes back to Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Blumenbach, German scientist, adhered to a principle called monogenesis that assumed that all humans were ultimately derived from one ancestor. There was human variation there that was due to degeneracy, i.e. some groups of humans, which he called races, had degenerated from their original form after moving to new inferior climates or as the result of bad diets. These groups were then ranked from best to worst. And he basically puts the skulls that you see here, he basically would take skulls, he did skull measurements, and he decided that certain skulls were the most beautiful, and those represented the most ideal peoples, and that others were degenerated from that ideal form. The original humans, according to Blumenbach, were Adam and Eve, and he believed they were white people whom he called for the first time Caucasian, who came from Central Asia, where he imagined Eden would have been. He supported his theory through the study of skulls. And this idea did not end with a Blumenbach, nor was it a fringe idea. Pretty much a who's who list of scientists throughout the 19th century and museum professionals, and people including Sir Francis Galton, obviously, but also William Matthew Flinders Petrie, the Egyptologist, and Franz Boas as a young man, all participated. Perhaps the most well-known and most influential book in the United States in race science was from Knott and Glidden, a book called The Types of Mankind. It was a defense of slavery, the enslavement of Black Africans, wrapped in scientific language. Basically, all of the arguments for this assumed a connection between genes, between evolution, which they didn't, of course, call it at the time, and environment. And all of them assumed the natural primacy and superiority of peoples from Northern Europe, contrary to ancient environmental theory, with a very interesting sleight of hand. So if you see here on the slide, I represent 2 pages from Knott and Glidden's Races of Mankind, and it says 1945, but it's actually 1854. I apologize for the misprint on the date there. But you see that the skull that they have chosen to represent the ideal Caucasian or white person is actually the ancient Greek sculpture, the Apollo Belvedere. So it's actually a Southern European skull, if anything, but then it is represented as the ideal form. And then everything else will be a degeneracy from that. Now, eugenics was premised on the idea that peoples divided by nature into these groups, which you could identify by studying their skulls, should not intermarry or reproduce with each other. Because the people were ranked into a hierarchy from savage to civilized, as I already demonstrated in the earlier chart, and only those people who were alike should be allowed to do so, as we saw in our Platonic text, the Republic. This is like Socrates' idea, right? So it is only a short leap from this principle to what we would consider anti-miscegenation laws. Jim Crow in the United States, which banned people who had African ancestry from marrying people who did not, and anti-immigration policies that the Great Replacement theory, which we started with, are central to promoting. Madison Grant, our man who authored the book The Passing of the Great Race, was a eugenicist, and he was also integral in helping write and pass one of the most important anti-immigration laws in the United States history, the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, which actually still dominates and still controls a lot of the US's immigration policy. He also worked to pass various anti-miscegenation laws, which included laws about what we would call the one-drop rule, which identified that anyone with a single African relative in any generation was non-white and therefore banned from intermarriage with anyone classified as white, and then would be subjected to the laws of registration. These laws that Madison Grant helped write were actually the inspiration for Hitler's Nuremberg laws. He adopted much of Grant's work and worked with Grant specifically on working them. Interestingly for Grant, his aim was set frequently on Southern and Eastern Europeans, whom he believed to be in inferior racial stock and not, as it were, true Caucasians. They were what he called mongrels or mixed. And so it should be no surprise to us that he was also a big advocate for an ancient idea that was really heavily promoted in Germany called the Dorian Invasion. And this map that shows the idea of the Dorian Invasion is actually from a German 1939 German textbook. The idea here being that you'll notice in the map, originally the Dorian Invasion suggested that Aryans came from what is modern India in the Indus Valley, but it's actually shifted over in time on the map. You now see Dorians invading from what is, Europe, right? Central Europe. Particularly we're in sort of parts of Germany. And basically you'll see that they come into Greece, they go into Egypt, they go into Italy, basically anywhere where there was a great civilization in antiquity, they must have invaded from the north at some point, and then from there they spanned out in other places. Hitler actually had the idea that that when he invaded into Greece in World War II, they sought in many ways to eradicate the modern Greek population because many Germans felt that they were themselves the actual inheritors, the real genetic inheritors of ancient Greek civilization based on this Dorian invasion model. And that the only reason that both Madison Grant and Hitler believed this, that these civilizations collapsed. So why did the Greeks, degenerate? Why did Rome fall, etc.? Why did Egypt fall? Was because these Northern Europeans who had invaded into the territory, they were degenerated by the climate. They were unable to adapt to the climate. The climate made them weaker, and they also intermarried with indigenous populations, and this made them degenerate and made their societies fall apart. As a result, you have people like Grant and those he influenced, like Hitler, who thought of the cultural heritage of ancient Greece and Italy as actually legitimately belonging to them and other true, what they call white people, right? Not the modern people of Greece and Italy and not others. Those people just inhabited the landscape that belonged really to these ancestors. These ideas still actually haunt the work of research of physical anthropologists and population geneticists, which I can mention towards the end. But I want to move now to the way that these ideas, so these theories did not exist in a vacuum. They actually became quite popular in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, and we actually see these theories operational also in a vast range of colonized spaces, of national pastimes, of national narratives. They became very popular amongst non-elites and amongst non-scientists because they were intentionally marketed, mass marketed to the people. And I want to move now to how that mass marketing was actually done. So I want to start, though, from the modern, sort of the most contemporary moment. In 2020, former President Donald Trump signed an executive order called Make America, promoting beautiful federal civic architecture, or often shorthanded as Making American Architecture Beautiful Again. The order required all federal agencies to adopt neoclassical architectural styles for new buildings. The policy, which was rescinded by the current presidential administration, stated the following, quote, "Societies have long recognized the importance of beautiful public architecture. Ancient Greek and Roman buildings were designed to be sturdy and useful, but also to beautify public spaces and inspire civic pride. They wanted America's public buildings, meaning the founding fathers, wanted America's public buildings to inspire the American people and encourage civic virtue. President George Washington and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson consciously modeled the most important buildings in Washington, D.C. on the classical architecture of ancient Athens and Rome. They sought to use classical architecture to visually connect our contemporary republic with the antecedents of democracy in classical antiquity, reminding citizens not only of their rights, but also of their responsibilities in maintaining and perpetuating its institutions." He goes on to say that Washington and Jefferson personally oversaw the competitions to design the Capitol building and the White House under the direction and following the vision of these two founders. Pierre Charles L'Enfant designed the nation's capital as a classical city. So this is from the executive order. The executive order was premised on the idea that classical architectural styles command respect, and that they also represent a form of patriotism and identity for the United States. This is not an architectural feature that is unique to the United States. You can see the use of classical Greco-Roman architecture all over the world in various contexts, typically colonized spaces from Europeans. Now, many scholars who specialize in the history of architecture understood that this order was also part of a much larger agenda by the president of asserting white European heritage as the only true heritage for the United States. It is, in fact, a racist vision of the U.S. that builds upon a deep history of mass marketing theories, that I've just discussed, eugenics, and other scientific forms of racism, specifically by using the classical architecture and art to designate white supremacist hierarchies and spaces. Now, as we already saw very briefly in my overview of technogeography theory and the idea that civilization is measured by a people's ability to manipulate and alter environment through technology, references you'll see throughout infrastructure discussions to aqueducts and seaports aren't surprising to anyone. It is unlikely that the people who wrote this executive order even recognized the influences upon them. They didn't know that they were, in fact, modeling themselves on the theories of Vitruvius's De Architectura and Hippocrates's Airs, Waters, Places. But the connection between what they're doing is long-standing. And more importantly, the real connection that they're trying to make, and this is why historians and art historians and architecture specialists saw this link to racist policy, is that the legacy that they were appealing to was not, in fact, Greece and Rome itself, but rather to what we would refer to in the United States as the old Confederacy, the segregationist states in the southern part of our country that attempted to secede from the United States, but were brought back into the United States during the Civil War that ended in 1865. Their leaving the United States and attempting to form their own country was, in fact, part of their policy of attempting to keep slavery as an institution when it was being removed as an institution within the United States more generally. And what we see there is the ways of using architecture to specifically locate classical columns and classical architecture to being white and to the exclusion of blackness. I have a couple of slides here from a dissertation, and there's been some subsequent scholarship on this by the author, Lear Montero, on the use of classical architecture on plantations to designate specific spaces as white. We also have had a long-standing debate in the United States, but this is also a long-standing debate in other countries as well on statues, particularly statues in the United States that are in honor of the old Confederacy, this secessionist, segregationist people group, and whether those statues still have places in the world when those statues using Greek and Roman form and idea are meant to glorify slavery and its past. What happens though after the Civil War ends in 1865 is the ideas of the South and of the segregationists don't disappear. In fact, what happens, they go national. They are actually incorporated into the broader, so slavery disappears, but the racism that undergirded slavery becomes embedded within our national institutions and popularized intentionally through the use of classical architecture. And here I want to sort of point to some of the ways that this was done. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 is not the first World's Fair. Obviously, the earliest of these World's Fairs is the Crystal Palace Fair in London in the 1850s. And the one that was the most influential on the US fairs is actually the Paris Fair of 1888, in which for the first time the French government brought to their fair peoples from the different colonies that the French controlled in Africa and in Southeast Asia, and they brought them and put them on display. They made sort of anthropological displays and created human zoos of these peoples, and then they of course brought back lots of museum artifacts. They brought back lots of objects that became museum artifacts from these different colonized spaces. In the United States, we sort of took this idea and ran with it. And what we ended up doing is in 1893, people inspired by the passing of the earliest Jim Crow legislation. So Jim Crow legislation is the legal policies that segregated Black Americans from everybody else in the country. So if you got classified as a Black, you might be a freed slave, but you were classified, you didn't have voting rights, or your voting rights were restricted. You couldn't eat in the same places as people who were designated as white. You couldn't ride the same buses as people who were considered white. You couldn't intermarry with people who were considered white. So all these restrictions, which we sum up and call Jim Crow, this was the first legislation of this sort was being passed starting in the 1890s. And this fair is put on using classical architecture in order to promote this idea of white superiority. This is also happening simultaneously with the United States expanding its way out across the continent, and it is at this time pushing out people from what is Mexico now, but Mexico, of course, extended well into the United States, and of course the eradication of indigenous peoples on the land. So these are some images that show sort of the way that the classical architecture and art was sort of deployed to represent basically white superiority. This whole thing was actually engineered on a swamp, so it is a feat of technological display of power. My favorite statue is the one up in the what is the right-hand corner, I think, for you. It's the sort of the horse and the man. This is the sort of citizen farmer ideal of the average white American. it's quite an interesting image. This was put in contrast, however, to the entertainment. There was a strip outside of that place, which was called the White City, and they built a strip of entertainments that was called the Midway Plaisance, that had all these sort of staged groups. They had Egyptians, they had indigenous people from Alaska, indigenous people from Greenland, they had people from Southeast Asia, they had indigenous Native Americans on display, essentially, as it were. And the closer you were to the White City, the less exotic you were, and the further away you were considered more exotic. This is very much parallel to the way that the Greeks and Romans thought of their own world, where people who looked more like them were in the center, and the people who looked further away, who lived further away, were actually more physically and culturally different. And you can see this represented in the book manuscript on the one side, which is actually a page out of the Nuremberg Chronicle that displays what we call the monstrous peoples of the earth from Pliny the Elder's natural history from the 1st century CE. The fair in sort of popular magazines representing the Chicago's fair and other fairs, you see the contrast between how white Americans were represented with the classical imagery versus how African Americans were represented using the racist imagery on the other side. This type of representation also adhered in the development of the circus, or even museums, sort of dime museums, but the circus is a great one where you have sort of the displays of sort of Cleopatra, but menageries were typically made up of exotic animals and also exotic or deformed peoples. So it was putting people on display who represented difference, physical difference, and often represented, they were non-white people often. These fairs continued because they paralleled American imperialist activities in the Pacific, as well as down into Central America. Here we have the St. Louis Fair from 1905-1904, which debuted the U.S.'s Philippine territories. It had different Filipinos represented, 3 different classifications, going from the civilized ones who were of Spanish descent, who could be or mixed Spanish descent, who could be construed as civilizable. They were represented in a schoolroom, and you see them in sort of military-style dress on the one hand. And then you had the savages of the Philippine Islands, who were staged in an actual mud hut village on the fairgrounds, and they were considered to be eradicated, as it were. And this, again, was contrasted with the classical architecture of the government buildings and as representing high culture within the society. And then finally, we get to the actual advent of booths representing the eugenics movement when we get to the Panama Pacific Exposition, which is about the building of the Panama Canal, where we have the sort of precursor to Hitler's art museum of great cultural art museum of Greek and Roman style art, where you can admire the physical bodies and compare yourself to them. This booth, which you see called the Race Betterment booth, was actually a space where fairgoers could go into the booth. They could gaze upon replicas of Greco-Roman statuary, and they could compare their own physical attributes to theirs by measuring their skulls, measuring their height, measuring different parts of their body, comparing eye colors and things to make sure that they were properly raced. Now, in each of these spaces, the classical is being used to denote the peak of civilization, with white Europeanness being that peak of evolution as well. Now, the forging of this link between classics and whiteness had consequences both within and without the academic discipline of classics. Within the discipline, it strengthened already present impetuses to whitewash our ancient Greeks and Romans, to turn them into white people, which is what the Dorian Invasion myth tried to do. More importantly, though, it excluded from the study of the classics the broader scope of the Mediterranean. It sort of like removed Egypt. It removed Tunisia and North Africa. It removed the Middle East. It removed all these different spaces that could no longer be counted as properly owned by Europe. And that has led to a great deal of loss in our discipline for understanding the ancient world and for understanding how the Greeks and Romans lived in the ancient world. More importantly, I think, however, in terms of the loss to the academic discipline of cutting out and excising the rest of the Mediterranean from our study, is actually how Greece and Rome through this process has been used it's been used as a foundation stone for this thing that has become in the modern world called Western civilization, or the West. It's a concept that developed arm in arm with the three race theories that we looked at: environmental determinism, eugenics theory, and the sort of evolution of societies, which emerged explicitly, right? So Western civilization and these theories all emerged sort of arm in arm in order to explain or justify why, quote unquote, white, elite, Christian, European civilizations were the telos of progress from ancient Greece in their modern colonial and imperial moments. The legacy of environmental determinism, which also manifested as tropical medicine in the Caribbean and other spaces that were colonized in the Americas, theories of evolutionary progress of civilizations, and eugenics, they continue to emerge today. Classics always seems to be in the midst of the culture wars surrounding these things, in part because they were so central to the way that these discourses around race were originally built, and they were intricately part of the education of the people who made the policies and built the institutions upon which white identity and the supremacisms and these scientific forms of racism were built. Perhaps the strangest return of classics in all of this, though, is how this thing that is often referred to as the Golden Nugget, which is this sort of packaging of Greece and Rome up into the modern world, as the supposed white Euro-American heritage of ancient Greece, how it is increasingly viewed as a genetic inheritance and not a cultural one, right? It's not something that people actually think that DNA somehow is involved in this. And I'm actually going to skip over, well, no, I'm not. I know I'm going a little bit long, but I think it's important. As we see the increase in the study of ancient DNA, it becomes more important and expands. Theories of great replacement, to sort of bring us back to the beginning, actually have reemerged in popular culture, in part because of the way that genetics is discussed and talked about, and how ancient DNA studies are being marketed and promoted. Basically, we run into a problem where we have geneticists working in ancient DNA who are searching for a time or a space where we can find pure forms of DNA, pure Europeans or pure Africans or pure Asians. Even someone like David Reich, who is probably one of the most well-known geneticists in the world working on ancient DNA from Harvard, admits that there is no pure DNA. Everything is admixture. And yet, this has become a cornerstone of the new studies. Why does this matter to us as classicists or ancient historians, and how does it connect to this legacy of race science that classics is continually recruited into? It matters because, as a recent archaeological article by Susan Hackenbach has written, many of the ancient DNA studies, far from reading the data neutrally, are actually being used to bring back and revive these ancient 19th century theories of population replacement from basically the Dorian Invasion is being revived through looking at these genetic studies, as if they are true events of population replacement. In other words, ancient DNA is being used to write histories that return to models anew that erroneously suggested that all Mediterranean civilizations were the products of Northern European aggression that are then were used to justify colonial apologism. And then they also stoke new fears about new waves of immigration, this time from south to north, that could in fact be restructured and imagined as population replacement invasions. Science is claiming to provide objective evidence that speaks for itself to support these racist narratives. And then these ideas are being circulated and recirculated and validated as they move into far-right media. Far-right ethno-nationalist groups, including neo-Nazi groups, are even using these studies in their political campaigns in Europe and Canada and the United States and in Australia and New Zealand to promote hate and violence on their web platforms. Ancient DNA studies of the Bronze Age that are searching for the origins of the Greeks or other ancient groups in the Mediterranean aren't innocent either or objective. They are part of an ongoing political climate promoted by racist ideologies associated with histories of colonialism and imperialism, and are being used to promote fear of diversity, fear of Euro-American decline. And they are part of a long tradition of centering the Greeks, centering the classics and the Greeks as this foundational moment, as I have attempted to show in these earlier theories and in the popularization models using architecture and art. They try to make what is a cultural heritage, something that can move and flow and be passed and transmitted to anyone, into a genetic heritage that only certain people are entitled to. And the ideas that are embedded in this search for a genetic link to the ancient Greeks is part of this history of race science and the struggle to connect to a pure Europeanness, a pure whiteness, and find it in the classical past. And our ancient sources, like Plato's Republic, like Lucretius's narrative of the savage to the civilized, embraced selectively and intentionally in the modern world, have provided fodder for people who want to argue the validity, universality, and authority of these ideas, even when the archaeology doesn't match up, right? This is one of the reasons why it is incumbent upon us as ancient historians and classicists to teach a more accurate ancient Mediterranean past. It is why it is also important that we work with our colleagues in the sciences and in the social sciences and across disciplines to help excavate the history of scientific racism and the role that the classics as an academic discipline and as a popular discourse has played in it. Because the race science of the 19th century has, despite changes in language and recognition of the horrors of the Holocaust, maintained a place in modern science. And the classical has maintained its place in the political and social discourses of nationalist and supremacist movements. These ideas may not have been racist in their original ancient contexts, but they were and continue to be deployed to support racist structures throughout the world today, even if we don't continue to recognize it and realize it. Thank you.
Opa! Então, a gente não é profissional, assim, na área de mídia, né, para fazer aquelas transições muito profissionais, mas a gente tenta fazer o possível. Então, pessoal, a Rebeca está aqui voltando, deixa eu só ver um pouquinho. Eu estou falando com ela aqui no WhatsApp e tal. Aí, opa, voltou. Então, assim, a gente anotou algumas colocações, umas perguntas legais aí que o pessoal fez, mas é claro que o chat vai estar aberto para discussão, né? Eu vou trazer aqui a Rebeca, então eu vou fazer assim, quem quiser perguntar em português, eu traduzo em inglês para ela, a gente passa aí para a gente dá um jeito. Rebecca, hi. Right.
I was just checking the message and sending you a message saying I was ready.
Ok. Aí, tá vendo o celular que eu falei para vocês? Ela tava lá, tô voltando. Então, ok, well, ela tava lá durante. You were there. I saw you were there during the transmission. I saw that.
Drinking my tea.
Well, water here. So, as we said, deixa eu ver aqui nas colocações que o pessoal fez, olha só. A Rebeca achou uma muito interessante, que ela mesma conversou comigo no chat. Deixa eu colocar aqui para você conseguir achar onde é que está. É porque eu olho aqui no timing do chat para ver a hora que a pessoa fez a pergunta. Então, aqui, ó. Já vou achar. Aqui, ó. A Francisca. Remember this one? And I told you, this is our Brazilian audience.
I think it's very important. It's a very important comment because that is exactly what they were doing in many ways. They were mining the ancient texts for justifications for their activities, but then they were twisting and tweaking what the ancient text said in order to suit their own purposes. Because, of course, the ancient texts say that Northern Europeans are courageous, but stupid. Because they live in this wet climate that makes their head cloudy and incapable of full thought. And also because the theory is based on the ancient medical theory of the humors. The idea is that if you have too much wet and cold in your body, not only are you stupid, but you also you're courageous because you don't know any better than to throw yourself into battle. But you also have an excess of blood. You have an excess of fluids in your body. So the idea is that you can throw yourself into battle because you can lose a lot of blood and it doesn't matter. Right? That's the theory. And because the central zone was originally the Greece, Hippocrates is on the island of Kos, and then with the Romans it shifts to Italy. And so basically these American and these British and these German and other scholars just then shifted the center up to them, right? So you just shift things around. But this is exactly
the one who speaks is the one who's actually the good one. Everybody else is not. So let me just translate that. Então, né, o que ela estava falando sobre essa questão da... Deixa eu só tirar aqui para a gente, né, fazer esse comentário. Então, aliás, assim, é engraçado porque eu coloquei esse fundo branco na tela porque os outros fundos da tela me pareciam muito feios, mas esse fundo tá feio também, então vocês me desculpem esse fundo, você está falando tanto sobre, sei lá, achei meio esquisito. Então, o que ela estava falando sobre a escolha seletiva que esses autores racistas fizeram dos textos antigos, né? Opa, aí fica melhor. Isso, os não profissionais. A escolha seletiva que os autores fizeram dos textos antigos, que é um problema não só dos autores que tratam dos textos antigos, mas é um problema geral de diversos discursos políticos e dos discursos políticos específicos que a gente está analisando aqui. Então, assim, você tira, né, extrai, né, do texto aquilo que te interessa, monta a ideia que te interessa, e aí quando você vai no texto antigo, que é o Hipócrates, ou Ares, Águas e Lugares, a ideia que está lá, assim, é o pessoal do norte da Europa, é um pessoal corajoso, só que é um pessoal estúpido. Por quê? Aí tem toda a teoria dos humores, a questão dos ventos, e aí isso traria características herdadas às pessoas dessas regiões, e as pessoas do norte da Europa são corajosos, mas são idiotas porque eles se jogam demais para a guerra. Eles teriam muito sangue no seu corpo, né, os humores, a bile, o sangue, etc., eles teriam muito sangue no seu corpo, e meio que tanto faz eles se jogarem, que é por isso que eles são corajosos, porque eles se jogam e perdem sangue e tá tudo bem, e é por isso que eles são corajosos. Ou seja, na verdade não fala tão bem assim do norte da Europa quanto os historiadores posteriores vão pegar esses textos e usar de maneira seletiva. Então, assim, deixa eu ver aqui, temos mais algumas... Um pouquinho antes da Francisca colocar essa questão, o João tinha colocado aqui um pouco também, falou sobre o uso da dicotomia entre, no caso, gregos e persas, mas romanos também, né, o Ocidente e o Oriente, usado como discursos racistas contra imigrantes do Oriente Médio. Did you get this? Or...
Yeah. So I want to say one thing first is that I apologize. I do tend to speak rather quickly. I will try and speak slowly. That way, Juliana can get everything that I'm saying to make sure to translate for you. Because I apologize that I simply cannot respond to you in Portuguese. It is not one of the languages I have under my belt. But hopefully, so I apologize to those of you who are trying. I appreciate your efforts for me. So that quotation, the comment that the individual put in is actually, it's exactly right. This is the way that this idea of Western has been constructed intentionally on the backs of the ancient Greeks and Romans in a way to actually demonize those who fall outside of this sort of this concept of the Western. So in antiquity, in our ancient texts, the anti-Persian bias in our texts is actually not as strong as modern scholars make it out to be, often because they're working from this modern ideological lens. But it becomes this environmental theory, and I didn't mention this, but the environmental theory actually has an overlay of a political theory. So you have the environmental theory, which is, of course, that climate decides. But if you look at a map today, and if you look at an ancient map, you actually notice that Persia and Egypt and the Levant, right? So this area that we call the Middle East today, are all actually in the same climate zone, according to ancient maps. But what they did then was they overlaid this political ideology that if people live under a monarchy, this perverts it, right? So only those who live under a non-king and live in the right climate are the right people. That living under a monarch makes you slavish, is what happens. So I'll stop there, Julian. I don't want to go on too long because I know
like piling up things that have nothing to do with each other, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But then it gets repackaged in the context of the modern geopolitical goals of European conquest of the Middle East and the exploitation of the Middle East, and then you add on the layer of Islam, which is just another layer of the rhetoric.
Então, assim, né, o que ela estava falando sobre a contradição desses argumentos racistas é que a gente tem as teorias ambientais antigas, e aí a gente está falando especificamente do Ares, Águas e Lugares, mas não só, né? As teorias ambientais antigas vão pensar uma associação, aí eu estou vendo na minha cola o que ela falou, uma associação entre o que o clima decide como são as sociedades humanas, enfim, como se comportam as pessoas, como se comportam os governos, enfim, as relações entre grupos sociais diferentes. E aí, quando você vê num mapa antigo, a representação que você tem da Pérsia, do Levante, do Egito, está mais ou menos na mesma faixa ali da Grécia. O que, obviamente, significaria, bom, quer dizer que é o mesmo clima, são os mesmos grupos, mas na verdade não. Aí você tem outra explicação por cima dessa, que é a explicação de, bom, mas são regimes, são monarquias, e as monarquias são despóticas, e as monarquias, enfim, né, o contraste com a liberdade grega, apesar de que não tem muito a ver com essa questão do clima, que aparentemente seria o mesmo entre os dois. E aí, para os pensadores mais recentes, isso se sobrepõe, isso se sobrepõe a questão do Islã, portanto, assim, camadas e camadas de justificativas completamente diferentes entre si, para pensar essa diferença que, a princípio, não teria um contato com a ideia do determinismo ambiental dos textos antigos. Vamos ver. Eu estou fazendo muitas coisas ao mesmo tempo, porque eu estou pegando os textos, as perguntas lá do começo, e depois eu vou voltar e não tenho a menor ideia de como está o chat agora. Então, mas vocês vão a gente vai sobreviver. We're gonna survive. I mean, I'm in the beginning of the chat here, taking a look at the first questions, and I have no idea what's going on there now. But I'll figure.
I'm following it. I'm following it. So
thank you.
Yes.
If you want to select something, I mean, I know you read a couple of things.
Someone pointed out this idea, and I think I sent that one to you about police work. And the sort of
the Cesare Lombroso, the phrenology.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah. What's really super important about that is that it's we actually have a whole series of ancient handbooks called physiognomics handbooks, which are the science of reading people's face and body to understand moral character. And this goes all the way back to Aristotle, to Aristotle's school. And it moves all the way forward to today. So if you look at police guidebooks to reading people, how do you know if someone's lying to you, right? Do their eyes move in certain ways? These all go back to these ancient theories about trying to understand human character by reading their bodies, right? And reading their expressions and reading their activities. So these are like, and they don't even question it. It's not a real science. It's literally just made up by Aristotle based on no actual scientific method or practice, but it is still used worldwide in policing today. So
today.
Yeah, today. I mean, you can go onto Amazon and you can find these guidebooks. And then they're embedding these ideas into facial recognition software, right? And AI algorithms. So I mean, this is, I am not as well versed in those particular texts. My spouse actually has written an article on it, but one of them is only left in Arabic because it was a translation from Greek into Arabic, and the only text left is Arabic. So he's read them. I have not read all of them because it goes all the way through the medieval period and into the modern world.
That's a bit too much.
Yeah, yeah. So it's very important. You know, I hope someday that someone will do the research on this and connect it to these modern guidebooks, because we are being policed by ancient ideas that are not grounded in actual science.
Primeiro eu vou traduzir, aí eu vou comentar um pouquinho de coisa que eu sei sobre esse assunto. Ela estava falando que, evidentemente, essas ideias da frenologia do século XIX, elas estão ligadas, de alguma maneira, a ideias que chegam desde Aristóteles. Então, só que a explicação de Aristóteles é uma explicação, na verdade, evidentemente, muito menos científica, uma explicação empírica, praticamente, sobre a questão do tamanho, da relação do tamanho do corpo, do tamanho da cabeça, etc., características físicas em relação ao comportamento das pessoas. E esse é o tipo de coisa que se vê em manuais de polícia, e a gente estava falando agora, né, manuais de polícia até hoje. Vai lá na Amazon, você vai achar os manuais de polícia sendo usados hoje em dia, e aí eu vou falar alguma coisa rapidinho em português e vou voltar para ela, porque, assim, não é a minha especialidade, a história do Brasil no final do século XIX, começo do século XX, mas nós temos, inclusive, vários colegas que trabalham com a polícia no Rio de Janeiro, em particular, então o estabelecimento da polícia aqui no Rio, e o uso exatamente desse tipo de coisa como uma perseguição racial, né, evidentemente. Muita gente que trabalha com samba trabalha muito com as letras e que tem muito a ver com a maneira como a polícia perseguia. Estou falando que não é a minha área, mas eu já vi muito sobre isso, tem muitos estudos sobre isso aqui, e de repente o que ela estava falando sobre essa conexão entre esse tipo de ideia e essas ideias da antiguidade, que é uma conexão, na verdade, bastante grande, é um tema bastante interessante. Eu só traduzir rapidinho para ela isso aqui que eu falei. I just told her that I know that this is not my field, but I know that I have many colleagues here at Unirio, here in Rio de Janeiro, here in Brazil, who study the phrenology, questions of phrenology in police and social repression, racial repression here in Rio. This is quite much a thing in terms of, it is quite very much a thing in terms of real life, but also in terms of academia as well. For instance, people who study the history of samba, it has lots to do with this. Like, today is Monday. Yesterday, I was listening to the radio on these samba songs, and they were the older songs were all about how the police would. It has something to do with the police all the time and people getting arrested. And I remember this. I remember talking to you about this. Então, gente, aí fica com vocês aí no chat, onde eu ainda não estou vendo lá embaixo. Se por acaso alguém quiser comentar alguma coisa sobre essa questão, porque acho que uma coisa bem legal dessa conversa com ela, e que eu acho que eu já comentei com ela que seria muito importante fazer, o diálogo entre os estudos sobre a questão nos Estados Unidos e as questões sobre a questão no Brasil é um diálogo muito importante. Então, assim, questões que eles trazem para nós, como, por exemplo, essa questão das feiras mundiais, e questão que nós trazemos para a América do Norte, sobre questões raciais e de uso da antiguidade para essas questões raciais, elas são bastante parecidas. Gente, vamos lá. Deixa eu ver o que está acontecendo aqui. Ela selecionou mais alguma coisa. O Vanderlei, olha, o Vanderlei tem uma pergunta, olha só, o professor Vanderlei fez uma perguntinha aqui, eu vi que tem também, olha só, tem outra pergunta aqui, eu vou contar para vocês que tem um chat privado acontecendo, porque eu já vou chegar no outro chat. O chat privado é o seguinte, eu mandei o link aqui do StreamYard para a Rebeca, e ela convidou duas colegas dela, a Jackie Murray e a Gina Kloss, que estão aqui no estúdio. Jackie, can I show you, Jackie? Can I just show you saying hi? Vou colocar ela na transmissão, tá, gente? Olha só. Can you tell us, like, who you are? Because I just found out you were here.
I told her you were my co-author.
Yeah, I'm associate professor in classics at University of Kentucky, and the extent of my Portuguese is muito obrigada, which I learned on the train from Salamanca to was it Coimbra, because I was going to visit Martichel. So I've been to Martichel. Out there in Portugal, but haven't been to Brazil, so that's the extent of it. But yeah, Rebecca and I are writing a textbook on race in the classics, and it's exciting to talk about this kind of stuff and get it out into the public, and really understand what's happening. So I'm really impressed with this particular talk. I was telling her this is the best version of it that I've heard, so you all should be very proud. And I've heard several. So yeah.
Yeah.
Bom, gente,
oh, go ahead, Julia.
No, I was just telling everybody, so in Portuguese. Professora Jackie Murray, de clássicos da Universidade de Kentucky, que está escrevendo um livro junto com a professora Rebeca sobre questões raciais na antiguidade, e aí ela fez uma pergunta aqui no chat privado. Should I go on with the question?
Well, so let me, I did want to say two things. One, someone asked if any of the stuff is translated. And so I am actually finishing a book right now that is it's called, it's a sort of more public facing book. So there may be an opportunity for this book to be translated into other languages. But it is on basically an overview of the ancient ideas of race and ethnicity. And then some of these, so what you've just heard from the talk today is part of the last chapter. So hopefully this book will do well, and then they will translate it into other languages. Yeah. I did want to hit up some of more of the questions that people had.
Can I just translate this part?
Yeah.
Não, então, o pessoal perguntou aí no chat se os textos da professora Rebeca estão disponíveis em português. Ainda não. Vocês sabem como funcionam as editoras. Se tem alguém que está assistindo, que tem contato com as editoras, pelo amor de Deus, a gente precisa traduzir essas coisas. A gente faz também, mas o nosso trabalho, infelizmente, a gente não consegue fazer com que a grande editora se interesse pelo nosso trabalho. Espero que isso um dia aconteça, mas ela está escrevendo um livro de divulgação, mais de divulgação acadêmica, sobre essa mesma questão da etnicidade no mundo antigo, e vamos ver se a gente consegue publicar esse livro em português, né? Eu não sei se os colegas de antiguidade aí que estão mais ligados nessa área editorial, não sei se eles estão aí presentes hoje, mas eu acho que seria bem interessante, inclusive, da gente começar a fazer também mais trabalhos, uma troca de trabalhos em relação a isso. Bom, ela quer voltar aqui, eu estou vendo que tem mais perguntas, ela já está lendo as perguntas, quer voltar. Jackie, can I put her back?
Yeah.
She wants to, okay, so.
The next question that was up here was someone asked, and they asked this in English. I appreciate you. Though I've been making ample use of Google Translate. Someone asked, how important are alternative views of the ancients, like these mythical genealogies that mix Greeks and Phoenicians, for example, in debunking racist discourses? So I think that they are, in fact, very important to make sure that those stories are out there, because most of the most popular stories are, of course, not those stories. And so right now, especially on the internet, the internet is filled with these far-right groups that always are repurposing these older theories, and they ignore any story from antiquity that is inconvenient to them, right? So part of what I do, both with my teaching and with my talks, and also my colleagues, is we try to make sure that we are making publicly available, and not just buried in our scholarship, but making publicly available more discussions of these types of stories from antiquity that actually show these deep connections between the ancient Mediterranean. And also, importantly, is reducing the amount of, and I'm not sure if there's a good word for this in Portuguese, but the exceptionalism, the sort of idea that Greeks and Romans are exceptional in antiquity, and instead recognizing them as part of this much bigger, broader ancient Mediterranean world that was a whole world full of mixing of ideas and mixing of peoples and mixing of cultures by sort of de-emphasizing this idea of what we call the Greek miracle, the sort of uniqueness of the Greeks. We hope to, in our teaching and in our public scholarship and public work, to improve access and knowledge about all of these varieties of ancient stories that show the Greeks and Romans in their actual interaction and context.
Então, eu acho que uma coisa bastante interessante que eu estava colocando na resposta agora, esse é um trabalho em construção que os pesquisadores estão fazendo agora, por exemplo, nisso que foi colocado sobre, até, inclusive para o pessoal em português aqui a pergunta, olha só, quão importantes são essas visões alternativas dos antigos, por exemplo, essas genealogias míticas que misturam os gregos e os fenícios, por exemplo, para acabar com esses discursos racistas. Então, exatamente, uma parte da resposta para isso é a gente procurar estudar o mundo greco-romano como parte e não exceção de um mundo mediterrâneo ou de um mundo antigo maior do que o mundo dos gregos romanos. Então, assim, e aí não é exatamente literalmente a tradução, mas é mais ou menos isso, a ideia da classics as an academic discipline is part of this idea of taking them out of the rest of the ancient world, né? Então, assim, essa ideia de que os estudos clássicos são parte dessa ideia de tirar os gregos e os romanos e fazer deles uma exceção em relação ao resto do mundo antigo, sendo que você vai lá ler os textos escritos pelos gregos, os textos escritos pelos romanos, e você vê que eles fazem parte de um mundo muito maior do que isso. Então, essa ideia do milagre grego, gente, vira e mexe eu vejo isso em texto, em tudo quanto é lugar, o milagre grego do qual surgiu a civilização ocidental, é a ideia do qual a gente tem que partir no sentido de demoli-la e entender que isso foi apenas um discurso criado posteriormente de acordo com todos esses valores colocados aí. Gente, olha só, eu estou selecionando, tentando ler o chat, tentando fazer a tradução e a retradução. Eu só quero fazer o seguinte, então, eu tinha falado que o professor Vanderlei fez uma pergunta aqui no chat privado, deixa eu só colocar aquela, porque aí vocês não viram, deixa eu só colocar rapidinho a pergunta dele. Vamos lá, ele está falando assim, ele diz, como esse dito ideal greco-romano é harmonizado com o cristianismo nos autores racistas? E como essa mistura, se é feita, é usada hoje contra os chineses? This is the private chat, Rebecca. How, the private chat.
Yes.
Vanderlei Vasilevsky Ribeiro. So, how this Greek-Roman ideal is combined with Christianity and the racist authors, and if this mixture is used against the Chinese now.
So I don't know much about what's going on with China in particular. I do have some colleagues who work on this, and Jackie actually has been teaching in China, so she may know a little bit more about some of this. But I can speak to the repackaging of the ancient theories. Let me just really quickly. So in terms of Christianity, one of the things that this is a particularly fraught thing in the United States because the sort of one of the other people asked how this connects in, whether the lost cause ideology of the U.S. Confederacy plays into this, and the answer is yes, because it has built itself on the lost cause ideology is actually put together and it shaped what we would call evangelical. I don't know if you guys use this word, evangelical Christianity.
Yes, we do.
That particular strain of Christianity, which is actually built on the lost cause, and it's built on the justifications found in, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament for Christians, for justifying slavery. So what we actually see is during the course of the 19th century, we see four major what evangelical Protestant groups begin to develop rationalizations for merging Christianity and antiquity to justify both Christian dominion but also white dominion. So that has a very long tradition in the United States. And it is actually, so I didn't say this because I was sort of trying to be concise, but Madison Grant, the guy who wrote that book, The Passing of the Great Race, who was like very good friends with Hitler, his Immigration Act was actually aimed at the Chinese. The 1924 Immigration Act that he helped author and pushed through was targeting the Chinese in America to prevent and limit Chinese immigration to the United States. So I think there's clearly a connection, but whether or not, I can't speak to what there might be as a connection for the contemporary moment, but it has a very, very long history.
O que ela colocou aqui em relação a essa história dessa conexão entre o cristianismo e a leitura racista das teorias antigas tem muito a ver com aquilo que ela colocou na palestra sobre os confederados americanos e o lado que perdeu a guerra civil, né, que é a ideologia da causa perdida, que tem muito a ver com o surgimento das religiões pentecostais no século XIX nos Estados Unidos. The Adventists are like that too, isn't it?
Mostly Baptist denominations. But so there's sort of there's four Protestant denominations that sort of got together in the South, but the different Baptist groups are the most prominent.
Então, né, os grupos batistas que estavam dominando esse discurso no Sul, né, e que tem a ver com o uso do Antigo Testamento para justificar a escravidão. É claro, né, o discurso do pessoal que perdeu, a escravidão foi abolida, e a tentativa de justificar a escravidão através da Bíblia, e esse é o sentido por trás do uso dos antigos para reforçar esse tipo de coisa. Aí em relação à China, o que ela acabou não tendo muito tempo para falar, mas assim, o Madison Grant fez a justificativa de todo o discurso racista do Madison Grant e estava voltado ao problema da imigração chinesa que aconteceu nos Estados Unidos no começo do século XX, né? Gente, tem muita coisa acontecendo aqui, eu tenho mais... vamos lá. Eu tenho mais aqui algumas perguntas que estão selecionadas. Eu estou vendo que o chat está animado. Coisa que eu mais gosto, infelizmente, é perder tudo. Vocês estão entendendo, né? Eu não consegui abarcar tudo, o que significa que foi um chat muito animado. It's not actually totally a bad thing that I kind of lost everything that's going on in the chat, because it's... I'm
totally following it.
All right. ela está seguindo, Então,
so I do want to say one thing. Someone asked if there's any additional material on the Nazis, and I do not have anything published yet, but this book, which actually the original is in French, so is Johann Chapoutot, Greeks, Romans, and Germans. But it is originally in French, so if anybody knows French better than English, or you can get it in English.
O pessoal de antiga que está aí, que se puder colocar no chat, ou se por acaso conhecer o texto, para colocar aí, ó, Chapoutot. Procura, quem puder colocar aí a referência total do texto, eu agradeço meus colegas de antiga que estão assistindo. I told you there are many Brazilian classicists that are here now, right? And I asked them to help us on the chat.
If they're more comfortable in French than English, you can get the original 2008 version in French. But this will answer most questions that people have.
All right.
This will answer most questions people have about so someone asked...
So many things, yeah.
Yeah, but I think...
the thing she asked after that, how to resolve this question of the institutions not to go on with racist ideas? Well, it's kind of a million-dollar question.
Yes, but that actually connects below to the question about the role of schools, right, in the subject. So I think these two are connected in many ways, right? How can our institutions how can our institutions, so for those of us who work within educational institutions, it's very important for us to work harder to understand both get closer to, we have to scrape away this sort of exceptionalism and praise of Greece and Rome over every other civilization, and try to get closer to understanding the Greeks and Romans on their own terms, as they understood their own role in the Mediterranean, and then teach that more accurate history that isn't explicitly promoted. So the way we tend to teach it is a result of the yoking of classics to 19th century imperialist and colonial projects, right? And to quote unquote white supremacism. So we have to deconstruct that and peel away those layers and be the best, most accurate professors we can be, and making sure that we are conscientious about those accretions. So it means both studying the ancient Greeks and Romans within their broader context and being more open to what the sources tell us instead of assuming we already know. And secondly, to learn the history of the use of the classics, right? So to study the history of the way that Greece and Rome has been utilized in anti-Blackness, in anti-Indigenous activities, in the construction of science. The more we can do that work, the easier and better it will be for us to counter these racist narratives. But we can only do this, one, if we want to, recognizing that it may mean that classicists have to give up some of our elitism, right? And give up some of our like thinking that we are somehow better than other disciplines, right? But it also, we also have to be able to, I don't know how much you know about what's happening in the United States right now, but right now, something like 17 states, so we have 50 states within the US, they are passing laws to try to prevent the teaching of the history of race in America. So classes like I teach would be banned from public schools. I teach at a private school, so it's okay. But they would be banned in some states from being taught. And so we have to be conscientious that we are in a political moment that people don't want us to do this work. And I feel like for those of us who have protections in our employment, need to make sure that we are studying this history and then trying to get it out there by publishing, by writing blogs, by being on Twitter, doing whatever we can, doing YouTube channels and things to try to make this material accessible.
And all of this censorship based in the idea of freedom of expression, right?
Yeah.
Which is a contradiction in terms.
But they're doing it in the name of, they're saying that it's very much a 1950s anti-communist sort of, as if we are anti-American because we want to understand race in America and teach its history, to try to change it, right? We want to change it.
Ela disse monte de coisa, gente. Primeiro eu queria falar oi para o Guilherme Moebeck, que fez a pergunta, que é especialista no estudo do ensino da história antiga, né? Por isso que ele colocou essas questões, que são questões muito importantes, inclusive já que essa é uma aula magna, para os alunos que vão se formar professores e no futuro serão professores não necessariamente de história antiga, vão ser professores no ensino básico. E para entender que o papel da história antiga no ensino básico veio, né, em primeiro lugar, dessa herança do ensino eurocêntrico, que nós aqui no Brasil sabemos muito bem como funciona, mas que ainda é prevalente, por exemplo, na estrutura mesmo geral de como se ensina a história para crianças e adolescentes. E aí, nesse sentido, duas coisas que ela falou que eu achei muito interessante, quer dizer, faz parte da resposta dela, né? Prestar atenção na maneira como se lê as fontes da antiguidade, para não serem lidas de uma maneira seletiva. Claro que sempre se lerá as fontes de alguma maneira seletiva, mas não dessa maneira seletiva de você buscar né, os argumentos que comprovem a excepcionalidade, a superioridade, enfim, do mundo greco-romano em relação aos outros mundos. E aí, nesse sentido, a outra parte disso, também muito importante, é entender a história de por que a história da tradição clássica e por que a tradição clássica se colocou dessa maneira e quais são as consequências e por que a gente estuda o que estuda da maneira que estuda. Os meus alunos sabem porque eu estou sempre falando isso para eles, né? Então, a história da recepção do mundo clássico em termos de história intelectual, mas também em termos de história política, é fundamental para a gente passar por uma imagem mais, por uma leitura mais crítica, né, de tudo isso. Tem muita gente falando sobre China, né? Eu estou vendo aqui, 10 years from now, I think this is going to be much more, it already is important, and I think it's going to be much more important than it is now. And I see Jackie saying yes.
Yep. Yep.
Do you want to say something about this?
I feel very fortunate. I think Jackie and I, and then I want Jackie to speak on this because I think but I think that it's very fortunate that for some of us, we started doing this work a long time ago. Like Jackie's been doing her work on Du Bois and on Black classes and things for years. I've been doing this for a decade. And I feel like what we're seeing right now is, as we're making progress and as we're making headway, we're getting the big blowback, but we're moving backwards less. Like we maybe get the blowback may be more visible, but we're not losing as much ground, I think. And I want Jackie to weigh in on this because she's been doing this work for a long time and can speak to this.
Gente, eu vou trazer a Jackie de volta para a transmissão porque ela está trabalhando lá com a China e ela vai dizer alguma coisa aqui para nós sobre essa questão do uso dos clássicos em relação ao racismo em relação à China. É isso, Jackie? About racism in relation to China? Could you say a couple words just about this?
Well, you could talk to I think also addressing the question about
there's a question here about this,
about the teaching. But if you know anything about China, great, throw it out there. But if not
about I didn't really quite catch that question. So can you repeat it again? Because I was like, oh, what is?
Why don't you start with what you were going to say, and then we can come to back to the China.
Am I muted?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, you're okay.
You're live.
I'm live. Okay. Yeah. So, Well, yeah. The reality, like teaching that the fact that our discipline has been, pretty much happily in bed with white supremacy, maybe not awake in its awareness of how embedded it was, and having to combat that when you're teaching, both just teaching regularly as a person of color, a Black woman, also teaching race and the classics. It definitely is now coming into its own, I think, because prior to that, everybody would think this is just not relevant. This is not real classics. This is not relevant. Yet this is actually, I would argue that this is actually the most relevant part of classics right now, because as Rebecca said, the ways in which race is constructed in America, in Europe, and in the white construction of race is tied to the deployment of the classics, right? And this is where classics is then relevant to, like, well, how are we going to actually deal with racism, right? If classics has just just doesn't say anything, well, just continues on, and that has happened. And every moment where so far in the past where it's come up in the culture wars situation, classics has sort of like either shut up and let it go, or actually even been on the wrong side of the fence in that particular war, right? And so this is the first moment where we're actually seeing enough people on the ground, like enough of a wellspring of people, interested classicists, who actually don't want to be on the wrong side of history on this particular culture wars moment. Right. And I think that makes classics very, very relevant. And the fact that they want to shut down, teaching of race and a proper understanding of history, racial history, is actually indication of how relevant it is. You're not going to get people trying to pass legislation on something that's not important. right? So the fact that they are very concerned about how to handle the unraveling of the sort of mystification of race, or the naturalizing nature of race, that we're puncturing that, and people are getting disturbed by it, and therefore trying to pass legislation to stop it. That tells you that we're actually doing something that is very relevant, and that's what we should do. Now, as to the other question, I didn't really I couldn't find it in the chat.
Can I just translate this part?
Pardon?
Yeah, go ahead and translate. It's in the private chat.
It's not actually a translation, because, but
yeah, go ahead with the translation.
I'll try to find a translation, but
we're in the private
chat. Something about what she was saying, what Jackie was saying about... desculpa, sorry, em português. Translation, desculpa aí, gente. Não, só para falar para vocês um pouquinho aqui do que a Jack estava comentando, né? Que nos Estados Unidos, o que está acontecendo agora é que tem esses grupos conservadores que estão procurando proibir. Aí, ó, que apareceu. Já vamos falar sobre os chineses, Getúlio. Então, esses grupos americanos estão tentando proibir aquilo que eles chamam de maneira pejorativa de critical race theory, né? A teoria de crítica de raça, enfim, que são os estudos antirracistas mais recentes, que estão colocados como se fosse uma coisa anti-americana, porque, enfim, eu não sei, é difícil traduzir, porque para mim realmente não faz muito sentido isso. Desculpe. But it's hard to translate this because this idea doesn't really make much sense in whatever language. Sorry.
Which idea?
The idea of the critical race theory, which is anti-American. Sorry, it doesn't really make much sense to me. It's hard to translate this.
It doesn't make much sense to everybody else either.
Doesn't make sense.
It's not a sense to me.
E aí o papel dos clássicos nisso, né, retomando um pouquinho o que ela tinha falado, o papel dos clássicos nisso é um papel fundador, não dos clássicos em si, porque os clássicos em si não viviam separadinhos lá no cantinho deles, e quando eu digo clássicos, né, o mundo grego, o mundo romano, mas o mundo que vivia em conjunto com o resto do mundo antigo, e a gente separando ele em uma pequena disciplina e colocando ela no topo do topo de todas as disciplinas, e, na verdade, este colocar da disciplina lá no topo é, em si, uma questão que está completamente ligada à história do racismo e à situação atual que nós temos em consequência a essa história das relações raciais, é muito suave, né, da história do racismo, enfim. E aí eu só queria complementar e comentar com elas, inclusive uma coisa muito legal que o pessoal falou aí no chat. No Brasil a gente ainda não chegou nessa paranoia específica. We're not still in this specific paranoia in Brazil yet. The current paranoia with education in Brazil is gender ideology.
Yes,
right,
but
like
we never know that tomorrow maybe they come with this. So the critical race theory in Brazil is really very also in the good sense. So sorry. It's also very lively debate, an important and lively debate. I don't know if you know much about this, but it's raging as it should in Brazilian academia and out of academia as well. But it hasn't yet come to these groups to. Well, of course, there's a very specific thing about the U.S. about trying to forbid teaching of anything. I don't know. Right. Well, maybe tomorrow I'll be proven wrong here.
Well, this has a long history, right? Because they some states banned the teaching of evolution when it first was in the United States, and we have a very famous trial called the Scopes trial about the teacher who
proving that this is not just a U.S. thing, right?
Yeah. But I think also your statement earlier, Rebecca, about the lost cause stuff is actually part and parcel of this, because in the South, the education, it's not accidental that it's in these states in the South that are trying to pass the legislation. It's also in those very states where there was an actual conscious active attempt to rewrite the history of the Civil War and the history of racism in America after the Civil War in the 1900s and the early 20th century. And so what's happening right now is a reckoning with that false story about America. And so the folks that are in those states are the ones that are producing the legislation to say, no, we can't have any contradictory, investigation of history that would contradict what everybody's been brainwashed into believing, from generations since the Civil War. So I think that also matters. So your point about the lost cause is really important, because there really was an active attempt by was it Mildred Rutherford, right? The Daughters of the Confederacy.
Yes.
Who wanted
there are over like 60 monuments in the over 100 monuments in the United States put up, roughly between 1879, 1880, and 1930 by the Daughters of the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
Using the sort of idea of and this is a Hellenistic Greek, Greek sort of statuary holdover, but the honorific statues in places in order to reinforce white identity and to reinforce this vision of the
rewrite the past too, the history of and also but part of that too was this education policy. What kind of books were going to be read? Only books that glorified the South. Books were banned, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a book that sort of was sympathetic towards slaves, and actually some people would argue was one of the causes of the Civil War, or at least certainly activated people sympathetically toward abolitionism, right? And so those books were banned. So kids growing up in the South from the 19th century pretty much down to today, because I know one colleague of mine, she teaches in the South. She was shocked to find out that some of her students were actually educated with this lost cause narrative about happy slaves and slavery was benign.
And of course, if you study Latin,
and the Latin textbooks,
but the Latin textbooks all promote this happy slave story.
Right. But to get to this Chinese question, I think I understand the Chinese question now. Somebody put it in English.
Can I just translate?
Oh, no, go ahead. Yes.
Não dá para traduzir, gente, não dá para traduzir tudo. Eu estou apostando de que a maior parte das pessoas que estão aqui, eu espero que estejam entendendo do debate, porque eu realmente gostaria de traduzir tudo, mas não dá para traduzir. Assim, o que eu gostaria de ressaltar antes que a gente entre aqui na questão chinesa, e depois a pergunta do Marcos Vinícius também, que a gente queria responder, a gente não, elas, né? Tem a ver com o quanto se consolidou essa ideia no sul dos Estados Unidos, primeiro de proibir uma série de livros que criticavam a escravidão, como, por exemplo, gente, como é que é a tradução de Uncle Tom's Cabin em português? Gente, quem lembra aí? Escreve aí no chat como é que é o nome desse livro em português, que eu esqueci. Eu li também. Mas uma geração inteira de crianças e adolescentes que cresceu no sul dos Estados Unidos sem ter lido qualquer coisa crítica em relação à escravidão, inclusive através, porque nas escolas, no ensino médio nos Estados Unidos, ainda tem muito lugar que se ensina latim, e aí tem vários manuais de latim que tem o personagem do escravo feliz. É claro que, não, escravo, cabana de chuto mais, era isso, Daniel? Que tem vários, então, livros de latim que tem aquela ideia do escravo feliz, né, um personagem meio, kind of like Plautus, the happy slave, something like that. And this happened in Brazil too. There's a long tradition of, which has been demolished for some time now, but a long tradition of historiography in Brazil and sociology, etc., which is about the happy slave. Brazil as some sort of in Brazil there's no racism because everything's mixed and we're all happy, and that's the sort of thing. So it's not actually the same thing, but we see similarities in this for sure. Let's go to the Chinese question.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about studies, but one thing that strikes me as similar in the way it operates in China, because obviously they're not going to be relating to ancient Greek and Roman classical texts to justify what they're doing. However, it actually maps on closer to the assimilation stuff that we see. There's a big deal right now in North America, Canada, and with the, like assimilating people to the dominant culture, which is one way of genocide, cultural genocide, where you're wiping out their cultural distinctions through education, which is what the Chinese government will claim that they're doing, is re-educating Uyghurs, when in fact we don't, re-educating them out of their problematic aspects of their culture now. So that is very akin to what happens in Canada and the US, which is becoming a big deal right now because they're finding how brutal and horrific it was. It would happen to Indigenous people in part of the settler colonial project, which is to either wipe them out or make them assimilate to white culture. And so I think it's in that way there's a parallel, but I don't think we could. Obviously, they're not going to have a reference to Greek and Roman texts, but I mean, I could ask a colleague of mine, but I think they might probably be appealing to Chinese classics, but I'm not sure. I'd have to find out, but I do think it's an assimilation project.
So, Juliana, can you translate that? And then she made me just think of a book that is on ancient, but it might be relevant. So, do you want to translate?
A resposta dela teve bastante a ver com a questão de como que as questões sobre assimilação e genocídio cultural relacionadas à China também tem aspectos paralelos com a do mundo ocidental, do mundo nos Estados Unidos, no Canadá, por exemplo, né, das populações indígenas. Mas eu acho que, na verdade, a resposta dela não estava muito ligada à questão que foi colocada era sobre a imigração chinesa nos Estados Unidos. Cadê? I think the question was a bit...
okay. Because one was about...
It's concentration camps in China, or concentration camps of Chinese...
Oh,
in the US.
So you're talking about in World War II,
Japanese mostly, all right?
Ah, yes, okay.
US. I don't know if the question is different.
Yeah.
All right, so it could be both.
There is a book on that is called The Way of the Barbarians.
Yes.
Which is written by my colleague. His name is, I'll share my screen here really quickly, Juliana, so you can see the book. Let me see if I can make this work. Can you see that book?
It should. Do I have to allow this? Add the transmission, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you see this now? The Way of the Barbarian?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So he actually looks back to the formative periods in Chinese history where this idea of the barbarian and the xenophobia of China is sort of situated, and how that embeds within Chinese institutions and within Chinese thought, which even though we are now, of course, in the modern period, we are now, of course, in a slightly different state, their relationship to the Confucian state is complicated. But these ideas still hover, and the sort of xenophobia that is rooted in these ancient and medieval Chinese doctrines still have legs. So it might be worth thinking about looking into something like that. I can also say that Xiaoyun, the author, also does do comparison with the Greek and Roman, because he's educated in that as well. So that's possible answer to some of the questions that people are posing about how some of these ancient ideas are still perpetuating.
I think this comes together with the following questions that have shown up here about Bernal.
Yeah,
and also to the other one that follow here from the same person who asked about the Chinese, in terms of philosophy, law, classical, West. We could put Bernal into it, I guess. As a start, Bernal's already open now.
Yeah. So and of course Bernal's a sinologist, right? So he's for the China interested. So my position on Bernal is pretty straightforward. That is, one, Bernal is not entirely wrong about the history of the field. Right? He gets a lot of that right. He gets a lot of his ancient material wrong, but that doesn't mean that it's not valuable for thinking with. The etymologies don't work, and he misunderstands the way, in many ways, he does what we often refer to as there's a name for it, diffusion model, right? Where you want to have a source and then everything diffuses out from there. And he just wants to relocate that from Greece to Egypt. But what we really should take away from Bernal, and what the archaeologists have been telling us for years, because they are digging everything up, is that it's actually more of a network model, right? And so my positionality in terms of the Black Athena debates is that we have to recognize absolutely that there is so much cross-pollination and mixture of ideas and movement and floating around that everybody is borrowing from everybody. And we really want to think in terms of networks instead of in terms of origin and diffusion. So on that, Bernal is correct. And he was actually not the first to say that. The archaeologists have been saying this for decades. In terms of the history of the field, he gets a lot right. Like, we did, in fact, build a racist edifice out of the classical world. What he gets wrong is this idea that everybody before a certain time period adhered to this ancient model. His ancient model is quite flawed. And the other issue that he runs into is that he, like Frank Snowden, who was one of his protagonists, his discussants, assumed that the ancient Greeks and Romans were white. And whiteness is a modern construct that does not actually apply to the ancient Greeks and Romans. If you were to call the ancient Greeks and Romans white, they would be insulted. They would think you were calling them feminine, like disease, as if you had some sort of diseases, or they would assume that you thought you were mistaking them for basically a Scythian who comes from the far north.
A Caucasian. A literal Caucasian from the Caucasus Mountains.
Yeah, literally Caucasian.
My father's family is in fact true Caucasian, so I have that going for me. Right. But so you know, Bernal is great to think with, and what we can actually learn a lot from, and Jackie will agree with me here, is the actual debate over Bernal. But that's actually more important than what Bernal himself says.
Yeah.
Can I just translate a little bit? Well, we're going over 2 hours, and we still have 72 people. We still have 72 people watching, which means it's okay for everyone who's still here. Obrigada, gente. Vamos lá. Para quem está interessado, porque na verdade eu estou ligadíssima e elas também estão. Então, para quem está aqui, eu imagino que vocês também estejam ligadíssimos no debate, que está muito animado. Então, o pessoal que perguntou do Martin Bernal, se por acaso aí o pessoal que está assistindo e não sabe quem é Martin Bernal, foi um estudioso especialista em China, na verdade, que escreveu em 1987, assim, o primeiro de 3 volumes de um livro chamado Black Athena, que não existe em português. It wasn't translated to Portuguese. So we have to figure out in English. E aí, basicamente a ideia do Bernal é que você tem uma tradição que a Rebeca falou que é isso mesmo, isso é uma tradição que consolida uma ideia do mundo grego distinta daquilo que você vê no mundo antigo, que era de fato um mundo interconectado e não um mundo greco-romano isolado, né? E como que essa ideia do mundo isolado foi se consolidando com os autores com o passar do tempo. O problema do Bernal é que a maneira como ele lê os antigos é um pouco complicada, porque primeiro que ele tem alguns problemas na interpretação das fontes antigas, e também outra coisa muito interessante que ela foi o que eu ri agora, que ela falou assim, antes disso, ele tem essa ideia ainda do modelo difusionista, que é um modelo bastante antigo, já inclusive dos arqueólogos, etc., dessa ideia de que você tem uma origem de um lugar, de um povo, e dessa origem todo mundo sai para os lugares, etc. Esse é um problema que é uma questão que não tem muito como resolver, porque ninguém consegue achar onde está a origem, de onde saiu essa origem, que diacho de origem é essa, e o problema dele é que ele vê essa origem, então, o que muita gente vê como a origem na própria Grécia, ele vê essa origem no Egito. Então, assim, metodologicamente falando, ele continua com o mesmo paradigma de origem, só que ele transfere essa origem para o Egito. E a outra coisa também que é um pouco complicada é que ele lê os gregos e romanos como brancos, como caucasianos, como se vê hoje. E isso para o próprio mundo grego não fazia muito sentido. Foi a hora que eu ri, ele falou assim, se chamar um grego de branco, ele vai ficar ofendido, porque ele vai entender que você está chamando ele de efeminado. This has to do with conceptions in art as in representing women as white, isn't it? Yeah. Então, I talked about this to my students. Então, quando tem aquelas representações de arte no mundo grego, que você tem a figura masculina de cor mais escura e a figura feminina de cor mais branca, porque a mulher fica dentro de casa, né? Então, se você chamar um grego de branco, você está chamando ele de mulher, porque a mulher que é branca fica em casa. Ou é um parâmetro que não é um parâmetro racial, né? Nesse sentido. E esses são os grandes problemas do Bernal. E aí, mesmo assim, o Bernal serve muito bem para iniciar um debate, que foi o que ele fez, serve para iniciar um debate sobre todas essas questões, que aí, assim, o debate que ele iniciou é mais importante do que o próprio livro que ele escreveu. Mas é assim, né? Se acontecer isso comigo, eu acho que já vai ser um lucro. If this happens to me, like if I write something that's kind of wrong, but people talk about it afterwards, it will be fine. I'll be glad enough.
So I would say there is I don't know how people's Italian is, if they prefer Italian to English, but there's a book that it was translated into English from the Italian by Maria Michela Sassi, Sassi, and it's English title.
Right on the
I'm going to grab it here.
All right.
But she actually wrote. She's a philosopher, an ancient philosopher. Well, she's not ancient. She's alive and kicking. But she wrote this book originally in Italian, and it is also translated into English. But I can give you in the chat here. I can give it to you. You can put it up. It is called The Science of Man in Ancient Greece.
Enquanto ela está procurando o livro, eu quero pedir desculpas aí para o Maurício sobre o mundo de inglês e um pouco de português. Aqui, assim, minha cabeça está ficando bem louca, porque eu estou tentando entrar no debate, conversar com elas, traduzir para vocês, pegar aí as questões do pessoal, mas vamos fazer o seguinte, ó, eu ainda não combinei nada disso com ela, mas eu sei que ela vai topar, se por acaso, ainda não, this is going to be a surprise, because I didn't tell you anything about it before, but people have been saying, well, it's a lot of English and little Portuguese, and I'm going to tell them if they want to forward any questions. Is that okay? If they want to forward any questions, we can forward them to you afterwards. Então, gente, se vocês tiverem mais perguntas, se vocês quiserem entender melhor do que se trata esse debate, que é um debate que está realmente muito, muito bom, eu estou muito feliz de participar desse debate. Se vocês quiserem saber de mais coisas, vocês escrevam. Olha só, eu vou colocar o meu e-mail aqui, ó. Peraí, esse é o meu e-mail, juliana.marquesunirio.br, e aí vocês escrevem para mim, falam, a questão tal que apareceu aqui, assim, assado, queria saber melhor, aí qualquer coisa a gente passa para ela, assim, sim, estava na divulgação que seria em inglês, né, eu consegui fazer a tradução da palestra em si, e o debate a gente, meu Deus, vamos ter que se virar aqui. Mas, de qualquer forma, eu quero que seja inclusivo para todo mundo que quiser entender melhor o debate, mesmo que não seja fluente em inglês. Mas, então, é isso. Caso vocês tenham alguma outra pergunta, etc., a gente responde com calma. Não quero deixar ninguém de fora. I don't want to leave anybody out of this, so we'll try to figure what to do if anybody comes with us some questions afterwards, because that's the whole idea.
Yeah, and I would say, I do want to just say one thing. I want to say thank you to everyone, obviously. For this, really, I mean, this has been these questions and these comments I'm finding really, really great and useful and thoughtful. I want to end maybe because I know you want to, we need to probably wrap up.
One day we'll have to end this, right?
Yeah, but I do want to point out someone brought up the question of right. It's you mentioned it, but we didn't really address it. But this idea with Bernal, the idea that our philosophy comes from ancient Greece and our law comes from ancient Rome, and Christianism is not important, to teach and study classics. But I think we have to remember that our laws actually, for many of us, our laws come from neither of those. Like American legal system is actually constructed on the English common law system. So this is actually a thing that's very interesting to think about how slavery survived in our hemisphere. Is those places that had Roman law as their basis abolished slavery earlier. Mm-hmm. And I actually was at a conference at Yale before COVID on deep history of slavery with a bunch of scholars who do Latin America and slavery in Latin America and the Caribbean and other places. But that Roman law in Florida, like Florida early on, was the state of Florida in the US, was part of, was run by Roman law because it was colonized by the Spaniards. And so it had a different relationship to slavery than the part that was colonized by the French and the British. But the part that was colonized by the British, of course, is English common law, which is not rooted in Roman law. It's actually a rejection of Roman law. And it also isn't necessarily rooted in Christianity. But we have to understand that it isn't just those things. If you have to continually make the argument that it's Greece and Rome that's the foundation, it's means because all these other things are also there too. We know that Thomas Jefferson read the Quran. We know he actually didn't like the Christian Bible. If you've ever seen a copy of his own personal edition, he cut out whole passages. Like there's an actual edition where he cut out passages from it that he didn't like. And he believed that the Quran had much to offer for understanding government and for understanding.
Source. I want to read about this.
Yeah, so it's not just the Greco-Roman world and our philosophy. In fact, whenever we talk about Greek philosophy, we force an exceptionalism on the Greeks, and we force this idea that the Greeks invented philosophy. They did not. Not only did they not. Are they not the only source for what we actually have today as the idea of philosophy, but political philosophy as well? But they themselves acknowledged it, right? But I think we forget that there was a lot of traffic across all of these different continents. People often think of the Silk Road, and the Silk Road is a misnomer. It's not a single road. It's actually a diffusion of networks all over, that these ideas moved as far back as the 5th century BCE between India and Greece, right? Between what is modern Sudan and Nubia into Greece, right? These ideas are all over the place, and they're moving all over the place. So if we can only say, I obviously think firmly that we must study the classics and continue to study ancient Greece and Rome, because they are foundational, and they're foundational because we made them foundational. And so if we want to understand how we are and how we're using them, we need to study them. But I think we should also be studying Confucianism, right? We should be studying Islam. We should be studying,
Buddhism.
Yeah, Buddhism. I mean, my family's Japanese, so I've got a lot of Buddhism floating around with me.
No, but I mean, there's direct contact with Buddhism.
Yeah, there's direct
period,
contact.
right? Because Ahsoka sends proselytes who end up in the Ptolemaic Empire, right? So,
and this is closer to our own world than we think it is.
Hellenistic literature, right?
So it's always more. It's always more.
There's always more to study.
And so I don't think we should privilege the classics as one. It should be one branch of a global antiquities.
Yeah.
Vocês viram que assim, né? A gente vai ficando empolgada, ela vai ficando empolgada. Eu sei porque eu me empolgo também com assunto. We get excited about the subject. I go on, I go on. And at one point I have to stop and translate this. But let's see if I can remember what para traduzir para vocês, até porque eu queria comentar também, porque assim, né, aquela grande questão, as nossas leis e e a filosofia tem essa raiz ocidental, aí, assim, você pode separar duas coisas, né? Primeiro é, digamos, a lei. Então, a própria lei. Então, quando a gente fala da lei romana, em primeiro lugar, no mundo anglo-saxão, na verdade, não se trata exatamente de um uso direto do que é a lei romana, mas sim da common law inglesa, né, que é da tardo medieval, né? Tardo medieval, gente, não é minha área, gente, por favor, corrijam no chat aí, mas eu acho que era isso mesmo. Adivinha quem que vai acrescentar as legendas? To put the subtitles in the debate. Se eu conseguir, gente, se eu conseguir ter tempo, eu posso colocar. If I manage to have time to do this. E aí essa lei, então, no mundo anglo-saxão, ela tem outro caminho, e eu acrescentaria que não foi uma coisa que ela falou, mas assim, não é a minha área, mas eu espero que, por exemplo, a nossa chefe de departamento, professora Maria Isabel de Siqueira, esteja presente. Se ela não estiver, ela pode falar depois, e vários colegas que trabalham com a história do Brasil colonial, porque, assim, uma coisa, assim, recepção, olha lá, André, olha lá, uma recepção do direito romano, e no nosso caso também, porque é o direito, primeiro que é o direito romano mediado pelo cristianismo. Então, você está falando direito romano qual? Aquele da República, Tito Livio, ou o direito romano mediado pelo cristianismo? E mediado por Portugal, nosso, né, all Roman law in Brazil, mediated by Portugal, mediated by medieval Christian Portugal, which has other completely different characteristics. Então, quando a gente pensar o direito romano, uma coisa é pensar o direito romano lá atrás, no mundo romano. Mas o que a gente chama de direito romano é uma construção longa e muito diferente nos diferentes lugares do que o que se tornou o direito romano. Direito canônico, aí, ó. Muito legal que o pessoal colocou no chat também. Então, aí fica mais complicado, evidentemente, do que simplesmente dizer, nós derivamos do direito romano. Sim, derivamos do direito romano, mas esse direito romano precisa ser pensado de uma maneira mais ampla. Assim como o segundo exemplo que ela falou, que é a filosofia. A filosofia surgiu na Grécia. Então, na verdade, não é bem assim. E os próprios gregos reconheciam que o diálogo que eles tinham não era só entre eles mesmos gregos, né? Eram diálogos um diálogo filosófico que tinha um caminho muito mais complexo, inclusive um caminho muito mais complexo com o Oriente. O exemplo que ela deu sobre a Rota da Seda, que aí acho que é 200 e pouco antes de Cristo, você tem a Rota da Seda, Império Han, né? A Rota da Seda não é apenas um caminhozinho entre the Silk Road, it's not just this little road between East and West, não é aquele caminhozinho, na verdade é um monte de rotas, e é uma coisa que eu gosto de falar para os meus alunos, assim, não é porque a gente, eu vou traduzir para elas, não é porque a gente pega um avião e é longe, e acha longe das distâncias, porque a gente faz assim, e 2 horas está em outro lugar, e aí a gente acha impossível que as pessoas viajassem a pé ou no cavalo. Não era impossível, as pessoas viajavam muito. It's not like we forgot the idea that it was actually possible for people to travel these distances on foot or on horse or anything.
Jackie's area of expertise is the Hellenistic world, right? Which is a world defined through travel and mixture and interactions and mashups, and it's probably because of our obsession with the idea of purity. Right, we push back into this classical past, and we call the Hellenistic world Greek-like, right, as opposed to really Greek, when it is probably the most dynamic and creative period of antiquity in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Which Jackie, of course, Jackie can speak for hours on that.
Yes, in time.
Vamos tentar não entrar nesse assunto. We'll try not to enter this subject. Vamos tentar não entrar nesse assunto, mas a Jack é especialista em mundo helenístico, e se é que você tem um maravilhoso exemplo de como que funciona um mundo totalmente dinâmico, em termos de troca, em termos de rotas de transporte, de etc., é o mundo helenístico, né, que é definido, curiosamente, por uma palavra que o coloca apenas como parte do mundo grego, né, mas aí a gente está falando sobre a tradição do estudo do mundo helenístico. Here we're talking about the tradition of the study of the Hellenistic world, why it's called Hellenistic, so it's another thing. Então, uma coisa é a gente ver o passado, outra coisa é a gente ver a tradição do discurso desse passado, né? O que eu quero dizer com direito romano, no mundo romano? What I want to say by Roman law in the Roman world, and what I want to say about the Roman law in other circumstances. Então, são duas coisas diferentes. O que eu quero dizer com o mundo romano no nosso mundo, né? Eu fico empolgada também, I get excited a lot too, I'm sorry. Eu peço desculpas a todos pela empolgação. I'm sorry, apologize to everyone. Vanderlei, he just told me, Professor Vanderlei Vasilevski Ribeiro just told me to invite you again to the next inaugural lecture. Olha, só falar uma coisa, o pessoal que falou do Borba Gato, lá dos bandeirantes, que aqui no Brasil a gente está falando também, agora eu nem sei onde é que está no chat, eu contei para ela no sábado o que aconteceu. People talking about on the chat about the Brazilian explorers, the statues, the statues. I told them I told them the story on Saturday.
That's a whole other level too of reception, though, right? Because the
this is the next inaugural lecture.
But the text that Jackie and I work on, specifically the ancient ethnographic texts and the ancient travel narratives and these ancient texts about ethnicity and race, these were the texts that the explorers and specifically also the priests were trained in. And so when they came here, they came to the Western Hemisphere, they came to the Americas looking for the Indies, right? And so they took their ideas like Pliny the Elder's natural history and Ptolemy's map and Ptolemy's discussion of peoples and all their peoples at the edges of the world, and what they expected to find was actually superimposed onto their stories. So if you read the letters of these explorers and Columbus's letters, but if you read the priestly diaries and priestly discourses that they sent back to Spain and to Portugal, you find it filled with attempts to describe what they see here when they get here with indigenous populations and with the landscape, the animals, everything through the lens of classical texts, right? And actually, Anthony Grafton wrote a really excellent book on that called New World's Ancient Texts, which may actually be translated into multiple languages.
I translated a book to Portuguese exactly about this subject. Jorge Canizares' Guerra.
Yeah,
I translated this book to Portuguese. O livro que eu traduzi para o português saiu na EDUSP, chama Como Escrever a Historiografia do Novo, Como Escrever a História, a Historiografia do Novo Mundo. E é maravilhoso, porque é aquilo que elas estavam... Maravilhoso não, é muito, muito louco, porque é o que elas estavam falando sobre a ideia dos exploradores, do pessoal no século XV, XVI, XVII, de conhecer o Novo Mundo com os olhos dos antigos. Então, de imaginar, por exemplo, tinha uns exemplos assim, que é, sei lá... os incas, explicar o mundo inca como se fosse uma república romana. Eles são parecidos ou são diferentes dos romanos, era uma coisa assim. Fora o pessoal lá na Patagônia, que tinha o olho na barriga e eram gigantes, porque, like, apart from the real savages, like in the Patagonia, so the eyes on the belly and...
Or the Kuno Kempoi, right? The dog heads, right?
Yeah.
So
Gente, então, olha só, o pessoal...
Go ahead.
No, the people in the chat are bringing up much more stuff.
Yeah, so I'm looking at
there's
all these additional additions into the... it is such a rich tradition, and I think this is why it is important to study it, but it's also important to study it not as we have reconstructed it, but to try to go back and to strip away these sort of 19th century, 18th century accretions, because the world of ancient Greece and Rome is in fact a lot more interesting in its broader context and with its broader, the range of understanding it from earlier periods up through the Byzantine world, but up through the Hellenistic period and to late antiquity, and to sort of to keep going and to understand it outside of Greece proper and Rome and Italy proper, and to see it in this bigger context, it actually gets more interesting, and there's more to study and more to do. And what we realize is that we can't actually say, I think, with any certainty, and with accuracy, that everything we derive in the quote-unquote West is a direct result of Greeks and Romans. To say that there's one person in antiquity who exists and that we only have an entire body of knowledge because that one person, whether that one person is, whether it's, Plutarch, right? Or it's Pliny, or it's Hippocrates, or it's Galen, or it's Aristotle, or whatever, is to misunderstand fundamentally the way that knowledge moves, and that the world works.
Right.
So there's so many amazing histories out there, so much to learn, that I love studying Greece and Rome, but I also really love Persia, and I really love the Scythian, the Black Sea region, and learning about those areas. There are lots of other things I love too, that I see the connections because I've done this deep study. And I think with Jackie, I think you could say too, the more you do Hellenistic material, the more you realize that you have to think bigger.
More. You have to broaden your horizon. Yeah. But this goes back to your point about the diffusion model versus the network model, right? Because I think sort of an underlying premise of most of classical thinking, classical scholarship, is the diffusion model. So even when going back to that question, that issue with Bernal, right? And so we have to get out of that particular mindset and think about networks, right? And instead of looking for who's the first, rather look at what is the interactions between cultures, how are they cross-fertilizing, how are they becoming more creative or hostile, however. But the point is that looking at it more in terms of this network model versus the sort of first and then who spread it out kind of model, because that is the problematic model, right?
Gente, eu tô fazendo.
I was going to say that diffusion model is the model that leads to racist constructions.
Absolutely, that's what I was trying to get at. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was going to translate this as some sort of putting it all together, hopefully, because this is exactly what you're doing now, right? Então, assim, não sei se vocês repararam, pessoal que tá assistindo aqui com a gente agora, olha como é que fica no final das coisas. Essa ideia de colocar só o mundo grego como originário, só o mundo greco-romano como originário, um ou dois pensadores, autores como os originários de uma ideia que se espalhou para outros lugares, um pouco análogo a essa ideia do difusionismo, que foi de certa forma, uma criação ideológica para tentar explicar, enfim, arqueologicamente, antropologicamente o mundo, mas que no final das contas esse modelo difusionista, se você partir dele, né, se você partir desse modelo difusionista para entender o mundo, ou seja, uma origem, um nome, um autor, um povo, você vai voltar para o mesmo discurso que já existe há séculos, que é o discurso difusionista dessa mesma abordagem, que é o discurso que, quando você olha para esse discurso, você vê que é um discurso racista, colonialista, etc., aquilo que a gente já viu. Então, se você partir de outra premissa, sair dessa premissa difusionista e pensar numa premissa de entender o mundo antigo a partir de conexões, né? Isso já faz um tempinho que a gente está fazendo. O meu orientador, my PhD advisor, he is very much like, this is the sort of thing he does. So I'm very much acquainted with the network thing. Aí eu penso, não sei se o pessoal do
I was going to say, I have an example that I think helps to clarify the problem. Baklava.
Baklava.
Okay? Baklava, the tasty Mediterranean.
The sweet.
The pastry with the nuts and the honey and everything. Right? If you try to find out, does it matter who invented it? Because I can start World War III, right? I can put a Hungarian, Persian, a Greek, and a Turk all in a room together, and I can put the baklava down and I can say, who invented this? Right? Or I can simply say,
Raki, you could do that with Raki with Uzo,
Raki
right?
as well, right? Is it the Turks, the Cretans? Who is it? But you put the baklava there, and I can either say, who invented this? And let them fight World War III. Or I can say, thank you so much for all of your work on making this the most perfect dessert in existence.
É tudo uma questão de perspectiva, gente. Ou você briga para tentar descobrir quem inventou a baklava, ou você agradece todas as pessoas que criaram, chegaram ao ponto onde estamos, em que o doce é gostoso desse jeito. I think this is a perfect way to sum up. It's not like I want to sum up.
It's a fantastic piece of knowledge. We have ends with dessert.
No, that's the perfect thing. Yes. Sorry, that we don't actually have baklavas here for you, or for me, or for everybody else. But desculpa aí, a gente não tem uma recepção no final da palestra com os docinhos do lado de fora, né? No futuro espero que tenhamos. In the future I hope we have. In the future I hope you can come here and talk to everybody.
It would be amazing to have a bigger conversation.
One thing I think it's very clear that the conversation is good, interesting, and necessary for for both parts. So we have lots of things in common, and the things we don't have in common, it's very important to understand why and analyze why. You know, right?
I would love to actually hear more. Like, I wish this was more of an actual, like, we were in a group together and we could sit down and I could, learn more about the way that this works in Brazil too, right? Because I don't know a lot, and it's fascinating. Like, all these comments that people, I'm like, okay, I need to make note of this and make note of this. All the comments that people are making, and so I just want to thank you all very much again, and thank you, Juliana, for the invitation to do this, and thanks for Jackie for popping in.
Thanks for putting me in here.
But thank you to the audience. This audience has been
amazing.
It's really hard to not feel one way, right? When you do this, and just the continued scrolling in the chat and the comments has just been really, really wonderful. So I want to say thank you so much again. And I'm happy to come back, and I'm sure Jackie's happy to come back and feature some of her awesomeness. And maybe someday we can do this in person at a sort of bigger event where I learn from others as well as sharing my own work.
Gente, então, eu quero agradecer a todo mundo. Jackie, you showed up. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gina, for coming too. She's on the session. Sorry, we didn't have much time to do everything we wanted. It's already 2.5 hours. Gente, muito obrigada pela presença. Eu espero que a gente possa continuar esse debate, tanto assim, como eu falei para vocês, né? Quem tiver interessado em entrar em contato mais especificamente, eu deixei o meu e-mail. Se por acaso alguém não viu no chat, entra lá no Google, escreve Escola de História no Rio. Aí vai aparecer o nome dos professores, aí vai estar o meu e-mail, vocês vão achar muito fácil. Ou o meu e-mail, enfim, a professora Rebeca, a professora Jack, vocês podem encontrar o pessoal e sempre procurar a gente para mais um debate, por que não, né? Inclusive, olha lá o blog, hein? Peraí. Your blog, Rebecca.
You want the link? Do you want the link?
No, I have it here.
You have it? Okay.
I start typing it, it's already here. Gente, okay. Dá uma olhada no blog dela, por favor, muito bom. Leem aqui os textos. E aí, quem é de Twitter, vamos de Twitter, hein? Vamos lá, segue ela no Twitter, que a turma do Twitter vai curtir, que tem muito assunto interessante. Jackie, you want to advertise something?
No Twitter, no.
Jackie does not do social media.
She's wise. She's wise.
I'm incognito.
Wise people. Because if you want to come here, Rebecca, then I advise you to change the title of your talk so we can have public funding.
Yes.
Whatever you want me to talk about, I can talk.
She's brilliant.
Whatever you wanted to say, the title, you make it up.
You know what makes them like you.
Of course.
You do know. Então, assim, vamos tentar, na medida do possível, trazer o pessoal aqui no futuro, na hora que tiver todo mundo vacinadinho, que todo mundo tiver virado jacaré. Eu expliquei aí para a professora Rebeca o negócio do jacaré. Did you see, Jackie, the crocodile, people turning into crocodiles in Brazil for to take the vaccine? Yeah, so when everybody's a crocodile here, then we can go to the
then
pond
we can
together.
do some more Egypt work. We can do some stuff about Egypt.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I do want to say one thing that right now, for any who wants to follow me on Twitter, just go ahead and request, because I made some. I said some bad things about Tom Holland, the British historian, yesterday, and so I'm just keeping my account closed until it blows over.
Okay. Just like what happened last month with somebody else.
I called him an Islamophobe and a misogynist and a transphobe, and so I thought I should avoid.
I see. Well, então, gente, ela vai estar com o perfil fechado por enquanto, porque teve um barraco com o Tom Holland, como sempre, você sabe como é que é Twitter, né, gente? You know how Twitter's like, so.
That's why I don't have Twitter.
It's temporary.
It's a crazy people's club, so. Então, gente, eu quero agradecer. O professor Vanderlei aí ainda está no... Vanderlei, dá um obrigado para nós. Aí, ó, ele não dormiu. He didn't sleep yet. Só dá um obrigado para nós aí, Vanderlei.
Thank you for you. It was a very good experience. Parabéns, Juliana.
Obrigada, Vanderlei. Vamos fechar aqui. Vou tirar você da transmissão, que a gente já está fechando, tá bom? Obrigado a todo mundo. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Rebecca.
Muito obrigada.
We'll do this again.
Yes.
E aí eu estou encerrando a transmissão de hoje. Muito obrigado a todo mundo que ainda ficou, 58 heróis que ainda estão assistindo a gente. Eu espero que se vocês gostaram desse vídeo, por favor, compartilhem com os seus amigos. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada.
No, what I was saying now is that if you like this video, please share.
Muito
obrigada.
Yeah, only word I know.
Muito obrigada.
Only phrase I know in Portuguese.
And everything I speak in a foreign language sounds as if I'm speaking Spanish. So, sorry.
Muito obrigada.
Just do it.
Obrigada. There we go.
No, that was great. It was great. So, thank you very much. Obrigado a todo mundo. E até a próxima. Opa, vamos encerrar aqui.